Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. October mornings in our new neighborhood had this perfect chill that made you want to stay in bed just 5 more minutes. But Bailey never let that happen. Our golden retriever had discovered the joy of having a real backyard after we moved to Willow Drive 6 months earlier. And at 28, I'd finally become one of those suburban homeowners who stood at the kitchen window every morning, coffee in hand, watching their dog chase squirrels. My wife Jenna and I had left apartment living behind for this exact reason, to give Bailey space to run. A proper yard with a 6-foot fence the previous owners had built. Room to be a dog instead of being cooped up all day. He'd bolt outside the second I opened that back door, tail wagging so hard his whole back end swayed, investigating every corner like he'd never seen it before, even though we'd been through this routine hundreds of times. That particular Tuesday morning started the same way, with Bailey racing into the yard while the coffee maker gurgled behind me, except this time, when I called him back inside 20 minutes later, the yard was completely empty. The silence hit me first, that strange absence of jingling collar tags and panting that usually announced Bailey's return before you even saw him. He never ignored his name, never stayed out when you called, especially not when you rattled that treat container he could hear from 3 houses away. The gate was still latched tight, no gaps under the fence where a 70-pound retriever could squeeze through. No broken boards, nothing disturbed at all. Jenna came running outside when she heard me shouting Bailey's name over and over, still in her bathrobe with her phone already in her hand, to check if anyone had posted about finding a lost dog. We tore that yard apart looking for any sign of how he got out. Checked behind the shed where he sometimes hid tennis balls, crawled under the deck with a flashlight, walked the fence line twice examining every single board. The next 3 days blurred together into a nightmare of making flyers at the print shop, refreshing Facebook lost pet groups every hour, calling shelters during our lunch breaks at work, driving slowly through the neighborhood until 2 in the morning with the windows down calling his name. Then on the 4th night, just as we were finally forcing ourselves to get some sleep, we both heard it clear as day through our bedroom window. Bailey's distinctive bark, that specific pitch and rhythm we knew better than anything, coming from somewhere close by, maybe 2 or 3 houses away at most. Jenna grabbed my arm so hard her nails dug into my skin, both of us sitting up in bed at the exact same moment, not even breathing as we listened. There it was again. That familiar deep woof followed by 2 shorter barks, the pattern Bailey always did when he wanted attention. We threw on whatever clothes we could find in the dark, me in sweatpants and a paint-stained shirt from renovating the bathroom, Jenna in my old college hoodie that went down to her knees. The street was dead quiet at that hour, porch lights off except for the motion sensors that clicked on as we hurried past each house, trying to follow the sound. It led us 3 houses down to the crafts place, though calling them neighbors felt generous since we'd maybe exchanged 5 words total since moving in. The barking was definitely coming from their property, specifically from the detached garage at the end of their driveway. And now that we were closer, I could hear something else too. Other animals moving around, scratching, a few soft whines that definitely weren't Bailey. My first instinct was to just march up and bang on their front door, but Jenna pulled out her phone, whispering that we should call the police because something wasn't right about this whole situation. Before I could answer, the garage's side door creaked open, and Walter Kraft stepped out, wearing flannel pajama pants and a white undershirt that had seen better days. He had this peculiar way of standing, shoulders rolled forward like he was trying to make himself smaller, thin gray hair sticking up at odd angles like he'd been sleeping on concrete. The man couldn't have been more than 5'6", probably mid-50s, with these thick glasses that reflected the streetlight and made it impossible to see his eyes. "Can I help you folks?" he asked in this reedy voice that reminded me of a clarinet played badly, taking a few shuffling steps toward us while keeping one hand on the garage door handle. When I told him we'd heard our dog barking from inside his garage, he tilted his head at this weird angle, like a bird examining something shiny, and just stood there for maybe 10 seconds without saying anything, long enough that Jenna stepped behind me, and I could feel her breathing getting faster. "Your dog," Walter finally said, not really a question, more like he was tasting the words, and then his mouth stretched into this wide grin that showed too many teeth, the kind of smile that made you want to take a step back. Yes, your golden retriever, beautiful animal. Such a gentle temperament. Loves peanut butter treats, doesn't he?" The specific details made my skin prickle because how could he possibly know about the peanut butter treats? And why was he talking about Bailey like they were old friends? He started fumbling with a massive ring of keys. Had to be at least 30 of them jangling together, muttering something about safety and protection while he searched for the right one. "You must have been so worried," he continued in that strange, reedy voice. "But I assure you, he's perfectly fine. Better than fine, actually. I've been taking excellent care of him and all the others." That word, others, hung in the air between us like a physical thing, and I watched Jenna pull out her phone again, this time actually dialing someone, probably the police, while Walter kept sorting through those keys with fingers that trembled just slightly. The garage door swung open and the smell hit us immediately, this mixture of wet dog, old newspaper, and something sharp like industrial cleaner that burned the inside of your nose. Walter flicked on a single bare bulb that swayed from a wire, casting these crazy shadows that made everything look twice as big as it actually was. What I saw in that garage still shows up in my dreams sometimes, not because it was gruesome or bloody, but because it was so methodically arranged, so precisely organized. Along both walls were metal cages, the kind you'd see at a vet's office, stacked too high and running the entire length of the space, maybe 12 or 14 total. Each cage had a water bowl, a small blanket folded into a perfect square, and a laminated index card taped to the front with information written in tiny, obsessive handwriting. Names, addresses, dietary preferences, medical conditions, favorite toys. Bailey was in the third cage on the left, lower level, and when he saw us, he started barking like crazy, pawing at the cage door, his tail going so fast it was just a golden blur. But he wasn't alone in there. I counted at least 8 other animals, mostly dogs, but also 2 cats in the upper cages, including a black lab I recognized from the missing posters on Oakwood Street, and a beagle that belonged to the Nguyens who lived behind us. Walter stepped into the garage behind us, moving with this strange shuffling walk, and started talking in this calm, almost proud voice, like he was giving us a tour of some kind of achievement. They were all in danger, you see, every single one of them, and nobody else seemed to notice or care enough to do something about it. He walked over to Bailey's cage and stuck his fingers through the bars to scratch behind his ears, and Bailey, my dog who usually loved everyone, pressed himself against the back of the cage trying to get away from him. "Your fence, for instance," Walter continued, pulling out a small notebook from his pajama pocket and flipping through pages covered in the same tiny handwriting, "has a weak spot near the northwest corner where the wood is rotting from sprinkler damage. Could collapse any day now. And then where would Bailey be? Lost, scared, maybe hit by a car on the busy street 2 blocks over." He had pages and pages of notes about every house in the neighborhood, sketches of yard layouts, detailed schedules of when people let their pets out, which dogs were left alone during the day, which cats were allowed to roam at night. The Nguyens beagle, according to his notes, was at risk because they often forgot to latch their gate properly, and the black lab from Oakwood Street had nearly been poisoned because the owners used pesticides on their lawn without reading the warnings about pet exposure. "You're all so careless with them," Walter said, and for the first time his voice had an edge to it, this undercurrent of genuine anger that made me instinctively move closer to Jenna. "Leaving them outside in thunderstorms, feeding them cheap food full of chemicals, letting them run around without proper supervision, treating them like property instead of family." He opened another cage and pulled out a small terrier mix I didn't recognize, cradling it against his chest while it trembled and tried to squirm away. "This one was left tied to a tree for 6 hours yesterday while the owners went shopping. 6 hours in the sun, with only a tiny bowl of water that tipped over within the first 30 minutes. His fingers were gentle with the dog, but his grip was firm, not letting it escape despite its obvious distress, and those thick glasses caught the swaying light in a way that made his whole face look distorted. I've been watching all of you for months, documenting the neglect, the casual cruelty, the complete inability to provide proper care, and finally, I decided someone had to intervene. Someone had to keep them safe until you all learned to be better guardians. Behind us, I could hear sirens in the distance getting closer, and Jenna must have actually gotten through to the police, but Walter didn't seem to notice or care, just kept stroking that terrified little dog while explaining how he'd been slipping into yards during the day when people were at work, using special treats he'd developed himself with calming herbs to make the animals trust him. The police cars pulled into the driveway with their lights flashing but no sirens now, and 2 officers got out, hands resting on their holsters as they approached the garage. Walter finally looked up, seeming genuinely confused by their presence, still holding that shaking terrier like a baby. "Officers, I'm so glad you're here," he said in this bizarrely cheerful tone. "Perhaps you can help me explain to these people about proper pet ownership, about the responsibilities they've been shirking." The cops exchanged looks that told me they'd dealt with situations like this before, one of them speaking into his radio, while the other approached Walter slowly, using this calm, measured voice to ask him to put the dog down and step outside. But Walter just launched into another speech about how he'd been documenting everything for the authorities, how he had folders and folders of evidence at his house showing neglect and abuse, how he was actually doing everyone a favor by intervening. He reached into his pocket again and I saw both officers tense up, but he just pulled out a thick rubber-banded stack of index cards, trying to hand them over like they were some kind of official report. "Every incident is logged here," he insisted. "Dates, times, photographic evidence I can show you. Temperature readings showing dogs left in hot cars for 12 minutes, cats without water for entire afternoons. It's all here, all documented. I was keeping them safe until someone would finally listen." What happened next was both pathetic and disturbing in a way that's hard to describe. Walter started crying. Not dramatic sobs, but these silent tears that ran down his face and fogged up his glasses, while he still tried to maintain that horrible smile. He set the terrier down carefully in its cage, his movements slow and deliberate like he was handling china, then walked over to Bailey's cage and opened it with one of his many keys. Bailey bolted straight to us, nearly knocking me over, whimpering and pressing against our legs like he was trying to merge with us, and I dropped to my knees to hold him, feeling him shake against my chest. I gave him his heartworm medication, Walter told us matter-of-factly while the officer guided his hands behind his back for the handcuffs. "The dose you were 3 days late on according to the schedule on your refrigerator calendar, which I photographed through your kitchen window last month." The specificity of that violation, the casual admission that he'd been watching us through our windows, made my stomach turn in a way that had nothing to do with the smell in that garage. The second officer was already opening cages, checking tags and collars, calling in additional units to help return all the animals while Walter kept talking, explaining his feeding schedules, which animals had special dietary needs, reminding them that the tabby cat in cage 7 had diabetes and needed insulin shots twice a day, information he couldn't possibly have known unless he'd been inside people's houses or going through their trash to find vet records. They led Walter away, still talking, still trying to explain his system, mentioning something about a larger facility he'd been preparing in his basement for winter months when the garage would be too cold. The way he said it so casually, like it was the most logical thing in the world, made everyone freeze for a second before one of the officers radioed for a warrant to search his house immediately. Over the next 2 hours, the street filled with police cars and animal control vans, neighbors coming out in their robes and slippers as officers returned their missing pets, some of whom had been gone for weeks, according to the dates in Walter's meticulous records. The woman from Oakwood Street burst into tears when they brought out her black lab, and the Nguyens kept apologizing to their beagle, like it could understand them, promising better gate latches and longer walks and premium food from now on. Inside Walter's house, they found what he'd mentioned, a half-finished setup in the basement with heating lamps, ventilation systems, and enough caging to hold probably 30 animals, along with filing cabinets full of surveillance photos, detailed maps of the neighborhood with every pet marked, and journals going back 2 years describing his growing disgust with what he saw as unfit pet owners. He'd been planning this for so long, convinced he was some kind of savior, and the really twisted part was that some of the animals actually were in better condition than when they disappeared, well fed and groomed, their medical needs attended to with a precision that would have been admirable if it hadn't been completely insane. We got Bailey home just as the sun was coming up, both Jenna and I calling in sick to work, because neither of us could imagine leaving him alone that day. He wouldn't eat at first, just followed us from room to room, needing to keep us in sight at all times, flinching whenever we walked past the back door like he thought someone might take him again. The detective who came by that afternoon to take our full statement told us Walter had been a veterinary technician years ago, lost his license after getting caught stealing animals from the clinic he worked at, supposedly to give them better homes with people he deemed worthy. This whole thing had been his twisted attempt at running some kind of intervention program, and he genuinely couldn't understand why everyone wasn't grateful for his help. We changed our locks even though Walter was in custody, installed security cameras that probably made us look paranoid, and started walking Bailey on a leash, even in our own fenced yard. The neighborhood felt different after that, smaller somehow, like the safe distance between houses had collapsed and we were all uncomfortably aware of how easily someone could watch us, document our routines, decide we weren't good enough. 6 months later, we moved across town to a house with a taller fence and better sight lines from the windows. And sometimes when Bailey barks at nothing in the middle of the night, I still get this sick feeling in my gut, wondering who might be out there taking notes, deciding whether we deserve to keep him. I had just gotten my first solo apartment a few months before everything went to hell, finally able to afford living alone, after years of splitting rent with roommates who never did their dishes. It was September 2022, and I'd been in this one-bedroom unit in a quiet building near downtown Columbus since May, working from home as a medical transcriptionist and genuinely enjoying the peace and quiet. The building was one of those pre-war constructions with thick plaster walls that actually did their job. You could barely hear anything from the other apartments, which was perfect for someone like me who needed complete silence to focus on audio files and medical terminology. Most of my neighbors were either retired folks or other young professionals who minded their own business, and the building manager, an older guy named Frank, kept everything running smoothly. I was 28, and finally feeling like a real adult with my name on a lease, my own furniture, and nobody else's mess to clean up. Everything changed when the guy in apartment 2B moved in that August, right next door to my unit, 2A. From day one, there was something unsettling about him beyond just the noise issue that would eventually develop. He had this peculiar habit of standing in the hallway for long periods, not doing anything, just standing there breathing heavily like he'd run a marathon. I'd catch glimpses of him through my peephole sometimes when I heard footsteps stop outside my door. A tall, lanky man, probably in his 40s, with greasy shoulder-length hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He never made eye contact with anyone in the building, always kept his head down, but you could feel him watching you once you passed him. The elderly couple across the hall, the Andersons, mentioned to me once that they'd seen him carrying in strange equipment at odd hours, industrial-looking cases and metal pipes that seemed too heavy for normal household use. The noise started about 3 weeks after he moved in, always between midnight and 4 in the morning, this rhythmic mechanical grinding that would pulse through the wall we shared. It wasn't music or television or even normal construction sounds. It was something else entirely, like heavy machinery being operated in intervals, 15 minutes on, 10 minutes off, over and over again. The sound would vibrate through my bedroom wall, making sleep impossible, and I'd lie there trying to figure out what the hell someone could be doing at that hour that would create such a specific pattern of noise. I tried earplugs, white noise machines, even moved my bed to the opposite wall, but nothing helped because the vibration seemed to travel through the floor and ceiling too. After 2 weeks of this torture, averaging maybe 3 hours of sleep a night. I was exhausted and desperate, making stupid mistakes in my transcription work that I'd never made before. That Friday night in mid-September, when the grinding started up at exactly midnight like clockwork, I finally had enough and called the police to file a noise complaint. The dispatcher sounded bored, probably dealt with these calls all the time, but she said they'd send someone over when they had a unit available. I watched through my peephole as 2 officers showed up about an hour later, knocked on 2B's door, and had what looked like a brief, calm conversation with my neighbor, though I couldn't hear what was being said. The noise stopped immediately after they left, and for the first time in weeks I got a full night's sleep, thinking maybe the problem was finally solved. I even left a polite note under his door the next morning, apologizing for involving the police but explaining that I really needed quiet to work and sleep, trying to smooth things over like a reasonable adult. Saturday passed without incident. No noise, no encounters in the hallway, nothing unusual at all. And I actually started to relax, caught up on some overdue transcription assignments, and even went out for drinks with a friend that evening. When I got home around 10 that night, slightly buzzed and in a good mood for the first time in weeks, I noticed something on my doormat that definitely hadn't been there when I left. It was a plain manila envelope, no markings, no address, no stamps, just sitting there perfectly centered on the welcome mat like someone had placed it with deliberate care. I picked it up, noticed it was light, almost weightless, and figured maybe it was from the building manager, or possibly even an apology note from my neighbor. The hallway was dead silent as I unlocked my door, and I remember thinking how nice it was to finally have peace and quiet again, how maybe things would go back to normal now. Inside my apartment, I tossed my keys on the counter and opened the envelope while walking toward my bedroom, pulling out what appeared to be a single photograph, printed on regular computer paper. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing, because it made no sense. It was a picture of someone sleeping in a bed, taken from above at an angle, like whoever took it had been standing at the foot of the bed looking down. The person in the photo was lying on their side, face partially visible against the pillow, wearing a white t-shirt I recognized immediately, because it had a small coffee stain near the collar that I'd been meaning to bleach out. My legs went weak as I realized I was looking at myself, asleep in my own bed, in my own room, photographed by someone who had been standing right there, maybe 3 feet away from where I'd been unconscious and completely vulnerable. The walls of my apartment suddenly felt paper thin, like they couldn't protect me from anything, and I had to grab the doorframe to steady myself as the full implications hit me. With trembling fingers, I flipped the photo over and found a timestamp printed on the back in small black numbers. Friday, September 16th, 2022, 1:47 a.m. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears as I realized that was last night, less than 24 hours ago, about 30 minutes after the police had left, and I'd finally fallen asleep. Someone had been in my apartment, in my bedroom, standing over me while I slept, close enough to touch me, and I hadn't woken up, hadn't heard anything, hadn't even stirred. I ran to my bedroom and checked everything. The window was still locked from the inside. The bedroom door showed no signs of tampering. Nothing was out of place or missing. My laptop and wallet were still on the nightstand exactly where I'd left them. The only evidence that someone had been there was this photo. This impossible photo that shouldn't exist, taken by someone who had somehow gotten into my locked apartment without leaving a trace. I immediately called 911 again, this time reporting a break-in. My voice shaking so badly the dispatcher had to ask me to repeat myself twice. While waiting for the police, I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and went through every inch of my apartment, checking closets, behind the shower curtain, under the bed, anywhere someone could possibly hide. The same 2 officers from the night before showed up, and I could see the skepticism in their eyes when they recognized me, probably thinking I was some paranoid troublemaker trying to get back at my neighbor. But when I showed them the photo, their expressions changed completely, especially when the younger one pointed out something I hadn't noticed in my panic. In the background of the photo, barely visible in the darkness, you could see the reflection of the camera flash in my bedroom mirror. And in that reflection, there was the vague outline of a figure holding up a phone. They took the photo as evidence, dusted for fingerprints around my door and windows, and told me they'd question the neighbor again. But we all knew there was no real proof he was the one who'd taken it. After the police left, there was no way I was staying in that apartment alone, so I packed a bag with shaking hands and called my friend Kevin to ask if I could crash at his place for a few nights. While throwing clothes into my duffel bag, I kept checking every corner of my bedroom, paranoid that someone might still be watching, and that's when I noticed something that made my knees buckle. My bedroom door had one of those old-fashioned keyholes, the kind you could look through if you wanted to, and there were fresh scratch marks around it on the hallway side, like someone had been picking at the paint with their fingernails. But what really got me was when I bent down to look closer. There were smudges on the brass keyhole cover, greasy fingerprints that caught the light, and when I looked through the keyhole from the hallway side, I had a perfect view of my bed. Someone had been watching me through that keyhole, probably for weeks, learning my sleep patterns, waiting for the perfect moment. Kevin picked me up within 20 minutes, and I spent that night on his couch, jumping at every little sound, unable to close my eyes without seeing that photo in my mind. The next morning, running on zero sleep and pure adrenaline, I went straight to the building manager Frank's office and told him everything, showed him copies I'd made of the photo before giving the original to the police. Frank went pale when he saw it, immediately started talking about changing locks and installing security cameras, but then he said something that made everything click into place in the worst possible way. He mentioned that the previous tenant of 2B had moved out suddenly after complaining about someone entering his apartment while he was at work, finding things moved around, food missing from his refrigerator, and once even finding muddy footprints leading from his bedroom to the bathroom that weren't his shoe size. Frank had dismissed it as paranoia at the time, thought maybe the guy was having mental health issues, but now he was starting to wonder if there was something more to it, maybe something involving the building's maintenance access, or the old servants' passages that had been sealed up decades ago but might still have weak points. That afternoon, Frank called in a contractor to inspect the walls between apartments 2A and 2B, and what they found still gives me nightmares when I think about it. Behind my bedroom closet, which shared a wall with 2B, there was a panel that had been carefully cut and replaced, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look and press. It opened into a narrow space between the walls, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways, filled with old insulation and decades of dust, except for one area that showed clear signs of recent disturbance. A path worn through the grime, fresh scratches on the wooden beams, and horrifyingly, a small pile of candy wrappers and empty water bottles stashed in the corner. The contractor followed the passage and found it connected not just our two apartments, but ran through the entire length of the building, with access points cut into several units, all done with precision tools that explained the grinding noise I'd been hearing. My neighbor hadn't been making noise to annoy me. He'd been cutting his way into the walls, creating his own private network of passages to watch and visit whoever he wanted, whenever he wanted. The police arrested him that same day, found him in his apartment surrounded by hundreds of photos printed on cheap computer paper. Pictures of me, the Andersons, the young couple in 1A, even Frank checking the mail, all taken without our knowledge over the past month. His laptop had folders organized by apartment number, each containing detailed notes about our schedules, when we showered, when we took out trash, when we were deepest in sleep, everything documented with a patience that made me physically sick to read about later in the police report. They also found recording equipment, tiny cameras, and worst of all, a key-making kit with impressions for multiple apartments, though the passages had made those unnecessary. He never said a word during the arrest, just stared at the officers with this blank expression. And even now, after everything that's come out, nobody knows why he did it, what he was planning, or if photographing us sleeping was the extent of it, or just the beginning of something worse. I moved out the next week, broke my lease without penalty given the circumstances, and found a new place across town, a modern building with security cameras and a doorman who checks everyone who enters. The guy from 2B got 18 months in prison for criminal trespass and stalking, which seems like nothing considering what he put us all through. But at least he's on the registry now and has a restraining order keeping him away from all of us who lived in that building. Sometimes I still wake up at night thinking I hear that grinding sound, and I compulsively check my closets for hidden panels, run my fingers along the walls looking for seams that shouldn't be there. The Andersons moved to Florida to be closer to their kids. The young couple in 1A broke their lease too, and last I heard, Frank was having trouble finding new tenants, even after having all the walls professionally sealed and installing a complete security system. What haunts me most isn't just that he was watching us, but wondering how many other buildings have someone like him, carefully cutting through walls in the middle of the night, creating their own secret network of passages, documenting the lives of people who think they're safe in their own homes. I sleep with my bedroom door locked now, a chair wedged under the handle, and a camera pointing at my bed that uploads to the cloud, because I learned the hard way that walls and locks don't mean anything if someone wants to watch you badly enough. My electric toothbrush was facing the wrong direction that morning. Sounds stupid, right? But when you charge the same blue Oral-B in the exact same spot every single night for 2 months, you notice when it's suddenly pointing at the wall instead of the mirror. I stood there in my pajamas, holding my coffee mug with the chipped handle, staring at it like it might explain itself. The bathroom still reeked of that persistent mildew smell that no amount of bleach could kill, and somewhere in the walls, the old pipes were doing their morning gurgle routine. Jason's door was closed, had been since I woke up. He usually got home from his warehouse shift around 4 in the morning, slept until noon, then disappeared again by the time I got back from work. We'd been sharing this creaky Victorian on Birch Avenue since July, and I could count on one hand the number of actual conversations we'd had. The thing about Jason was that he moved through the house like smoke. In 2 months of living one thin wall away from him, I'd never heard him sneeze, cough, or even clear his throat. Sometimes I'd come out of my room and he'd just be standing in the kitchen, so still and quiet that I'd actually gasp when I noticed him. He'd do this slow blink thing, like a reptile processing whether you're prey or not, then go back to whatever he was doing, usually eating cereal straight from the box or staring at his phone with the screen brightness turned way down. 30-something years old and built like someone had stretched a normal person out on a rack, all gangly limbs and sharp elbows, but harmless. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself whenever that little alarm bell went off in my head. After the toothbrush incident, more things started being out of place. My favorite sweater, this oversized burgundy thing I'd stolen from an ex, was folded differently in my drawer. Not messy, just different. The sleeves tucked under instead of over, like someone who didn't know my system had carefully put it back. Then my perfume bottle migrated 3 inches to the left on my dresser. My laptop charger got wrapped with the cord going clockwise instead of counterclockwise. Little things that made me feel like I was going crazy, because who the hell would notice which way their charger cord was wrapped? But when you live alone in your own space, even with a roommate in the house, you develop these unconscious patterns. And when those patterns get disrupted, your brain starts firing off warning signals even if you can't articulate exactly what's wrong. I started testing myself, taking photos of my room before leaving for work each morning. Phone propped against my mirror, capturing my desk, my dresser, my nightstand, even the way my shoes lined up by the door. Then I'd compare them when I got home, zooming in like some kind of detective, looking for differences. Most days, nothing. But then on a Friday, 2 weeks after the toothbrush thing, I caught it. My hairbrush had rotated maybe 45 degrees. The book on my nightstand, some self-help garbage about reclaiming your power after trauma that my sister had given me, was closed, even though I distinctly remembered leaving it open, pages down, to hold my place because I'd lost the receipt I was using as a bookmark. These weren't things that could happen from the house settling or vibrations from trucks outside. Someone had been in my room. The rational part of my brain kept making excuses. Maybe I was stressed from the Johnson campaign at work. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I had some kind of weird memory problem. I even Googled carbon monoxide poisoning symptoms, because I'd read this Reddit thread once about someone who kept finding creepy notes in their apartment that turned out to be from themselves during co-induced blackouts. Bought a detector that same day, $23 at Home Depot, and installed it in my room. The levels were fine. Everything was fine. Except I knew it wasn't. That crawling sensation you get when someone's watching you? I had it constantly now, even when Jason wasn't home, especially in my room, like the walls themselves had absorbed someone's attention and were playing it back on a loop. I tried the logical approach first, changed my door handle to one with a lock. Jason didn't say anything about it when we passed in the hallway, just did his signature slow blink and shuffled to the kitchen. Started keeping my valuable stuff in a lockbox under my bed, jewelry, passport, the emergency cash my dad insisted I keep hidden. But the little disturbances continued. A single hair tie moved from my nightstand to my desk. My face wash turned backward in the shower caddy, my pillow slightly off-center on the bed. Whoever was doing this wasn't interested in stealing from me. They just wanted to touch my things, to leave these tiny fingerprints on my life that only I would notice. It was like living with a ghost who got their kicks from gaslighting you. Except ghosts don't eat Lucky Charms at 2 in the morning or leave their work boots by the front door. The camera was $49 on Amazon, this tiny thing that looked like a phone charger cube. I set it up on a Sunday when Jason was at work, positioned it on my bookshelf between a fake plant and some old college textbooks I'd never thrown away. The angle captured most of my room, the bed, the door, the dresser. The app sent clips to my phone whenever it detected motion. The first few days were just me getting ready in the morning, coming home and flopping on my bed. Normal stuff. I started to feel stupid, paranoid, like maybe I really was just stressed and imagining things. Then Wednesday night happened. I was at my friend Megan's place for her birthday dinner, one of those wine and pasta nights that stretched until midnight. Jason would definitely be at work. He always left by 7:30 sharp. But at 9:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert. The video was 18 seconds long, and I watched it right there at Megan's dining table while everyone else was arguing about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. The quality was grainy in the low light, but clear enough to see my bedroom door slowly open. A figure stood in the doorway for a full 5 seconds, just a dark silhouette against the hallway light. Then Jason, unmistakably Jason with his too tall frame and mantis-like posture, stepped inside. He moved weird, like he was walking through water or trying not to disturb the air molecules. He went straight to my bed, stood beside it for 3 seconds, then carefully, deliberately sat down on my floor, right beside the bed. The video cut off there because he'd stopped moving enough to trigger the motion sensor. But I knew he was still there, just sitting, in the dark, next to where I sleep. I left Megan's immediately, made up some excuse about food poisoning and drove to the 24-hour Walmart parking lot. Sat there in my car with the doors locked, going through every video from the past 3 days with this sick weight in my stomach. There were more, so many more. Every single night Jason had come into my room, sometimes at 10, sometimes at 2 in the morning, but always the same routine. Enter slowly, walk to my bed, sit on the floor. The camera only caught him in clips when he moved, but by comparing the timestamps I figured out he was staying in there for hours. 3 hours one night, 4.5 another, just sitting on my floor in the dark, facing my bed, completely still. In one video from Monday night, the infrared picked up his face when he shifted slightly. His eyes were open, staring directly at where my head would be on the pillow. Not sleeping, not on his phone, just watching the space where I would have been. The worst part was finding myself in the footage. There I was, dead asleep, sprawled across my bed with my mouth probably open, completely defenseless while this man sat 3 feet away from me in the darkness. In one clip from Saturday night, I turned over in my sleep, arm hanging off the bed, fingers nearly touching the floor where he sat. He didn't move away. He just stayed perfectly still, letting my hand dangle inches from him. Another video showed him doing something with his hands near his face. It took me 6 replays to realize he was smelling something. My hair tie. The one that had been moved from my nightstand. He'd been collecting them, these little pieces of me, and just sitting there in the dark, breathing them in while I slept above him completely unaware. I called the police from that Walmart parking lot, but what do you even say? A grown man entering my room at night without permission was enough to get them interested at least. 2 officers met me back at the house at 1 in the morning. Jason's shift would keep him away until 4. They took my statement, watched the videos, and one of them actually went pale when he saw the footage of Jason just sitting there, staring. They helped me grab my essential stuff while we waited for the emergency protective order paperwork to go through. I remember the younger cop kept checking behind doors as we packed, like he expected Jason to materialize from the shadows. They waited while I stuffed clothes into garbage bags, grabbed my laptop, my documents, anything I couldn't replace. The older officer told me I was smart to get out, that these situations tend to escalate, that people who violate boundaries like this rarely stop on their own. He said it real quiet, like he'd seen where this kind of thing leads. I stayed at Megan's place that night, and for 2 weeks after while I searched for a new apartment. The landlord let me break the lease without penalty after the police explained the situation. Jason was evicted within a week. Turns out I wasn't the first complaint, just the first with video evidence. Megan came with me to get the rest of my stuff on a Saturday afternoon. Broad daylight, Jason long gone according to the landlord. But his room door was open, and I couldn't help looking inside as we passed. The walls were covered, absolutely covered, with photos printed on regular paper. All of rooms, not just mine, but previous tenants' rooms too, based on the different furniture. All taken from floor level, as if someone was sitting on the ground looking up at empty beds. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, overlapping like scales. In the center, newer than the rest, were screenshots from my social media, pictures I'd posted of myself in my room, selfies on my bed, but edited somehow, zoomed in on my sleeping face in the background of a mirror selfie I'd taken months ago. How long had he been planning this? How many others had there been before me? I never got those answers because Jason disappeared completely after the eviction. The police said he'd given a fake last name on the lease, paid rent in cash, and the warehouse had no record of him working there. Sometimes I still dream about those hours he sat in my room, and I wake up checking the floor beside my bed, even though I live alone now in a studio apartment with 3 deadbolts and a security system. Sometimes I still feel like someone's watching me sleep, but at least now I know it's just the ghost of that fear, not a real person sitting in the darkness, breathing in the scent of my life. The house on Hawthorne Lane wasn't much to look at. Yellow siding that needed repainting, a cramped kitchen with outdated appliances, and a yard so small you could mow it in 5 minutes flat. But for a 26-year-old veterinary assistant trying to save money, it was exactly what I needed. I'd been working at the animal clinic downtown for about 8 months when I found the rental listing, and the price was too good to pass up. Moving day was a Saturday in August. Just me and a borrowed pickup truck full of secondhand furniture and cardboard boxes labeled in my messy handwriting. The neighborhood seemed quiet, almost sleepy, with kids riding bikes in lazy circles and sprinklers clicking across brown lawns. I remember thinking how normal everything looked, how perfectly suburban and safe, the kind of place where people probably still left their doors unlocked. That first week I kept busy unpacking and trying to make the place feel like home, hanging curtains and scrubbing years of grime off the bathroom tiles. My neighbor to the left was a man named Douglas Harmon, probably in his early 50s, with thinning gray hair that he always combed straight back with too much gel. He worked at the local hardware store. I'd seen him there when I bought paint for my bedroom, and drove a beige Toyota Camry that he washed every Sunday morning at exactly 8:30. Douglas had this peculiar way of smiling, where only the corners of his mouth moved up while his eyes stayed completely flat, like someone had taught him the mechanics of smiling, but not the actual emotion behind it. He'd wave when he saw me getting my mail, always the same rigid motion like he was signaling a plane for landing. The thing that struck me most about Douglas was how methodical he was about everything. His lawn was cut in perfect diagonal stripes, His garbage cans were always placed exactly 3 feet from the curb, and every single night at 9:15, he'd walk out to his backyard shed with a heavy padlock and secure it with 3 separate clicks that I could hear through my bedroom window. At first, I didn't think much about the shed routine. Plenty of people lock up their tools or lawn equipment, especially in neighborhoods where teenagers might get bored and start poking around. But after a few weeks, I started noticing other things about Douglas and that weathered wooden structure at the back of his property. The shed itself was maybe 8 by 10 feet, painted the same faded green as his house trim, with a single window covered from the inside by what looked like aluminum foil. He'd check that padlock in the morning before leaving for work, sometimes pulling on it 2 or 3 times to make sure it held. On weekends, he'd spend hours out there with the door cracked just wide enough for him to slip through, and I'd hear the faint sound of shuffling papers and the occasional metallic scrape. Once when I was trimming the bushes along our shared fence line, he came out so fast when he heard me that he left the shed door swinging open for maybe 2 seconds before he yanked it shut and gave me that mechanical smile, asking if I needed to borrow any gardening tools. The really strange part started about 2 months after I moved in, on a Wednesday afternoon in early November. I'd called in sick to work because of a nasty stomach bug that had me running to the bathroom every hour. Around 3 in the afternoon, I was lying on my couch trying to keep down some crackers when I heard Douglas's car pull into his driveway, way earlier than his usual 6 o'clock return. Through the thin curtains, I watched him practically sprint to his backyard, fumbling with his keys like his fingers weren't working right. He unlocked the shed and disappeared inside for maybe 20 minutes, then emerged carrying a cardboard box that he held against his chest with both arms, the way you'd carry something fragile or precious. He loaded it into his trunk and drove off again, but not before I noticed him checking his rearview mirror 3 times before backing out, scanning the street like he expected someone to be watching. That night, the shed locking ritual happened at 9:15 as always, but this time he added a second padlock to the door, one of those circular ones that are supposed to be impossible to cut. I know I should have minded my own business, but living alone in a new place makes you hyper-aware of everything around you, especially when your neighbor starts acting like he's guarding state secrets in a backyard shed. I found myself creating excuses to be in my yard whenever Douglas was home, watering plants that didn't need water, checking a mailbox I knew was empty, pretending to look for a lost earring in the grass near the fence. He caught me watching once, just stood there in his backyard holding a black garbage bag, staring at me with those empty eyes for what felt like a full minute before he asked if I'd seen any stray cats around. The question came out of nowhere, and when I said no, he nodded slowly and said that was good, because he'd hate for any animals to get into his shed and make a mess of his important documents. The way he emphasized important documents made my skin prickle, like he was warning me without actually warning me. After that encounter, I started keeping my blinds closed more often, but I could still hear him out there every night, checking those locks like his life depended on it. The storm hit on a Saturday night in late November, one of those sudden November storms that comes out of nowhere, with winds that make your windows rattle and rain that sounds like someone throwing gravel at your roof. I was in bed reading when the power flickered twice and then went out completely, leaving me in that thick darkness where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I fumbled for my phone and used the flashlight to find some candles in the kitchen, and that's when I heard it, a loud bang from Douglas's backyard, the unmistakable sound of wood hitting wood. Through my kitchen window, I could see his shed door had blown open and was slamming against the frame with each gust of wind. The strange thing was, Douglas's house was completely dark too, but his car wasn't in the driveway. He'd left about an hour earlier, which I only knew because I'd heard his car door slam and the engine start up. The shed door kept banging, and I kept staring at that dark rectangle of the doorway, telling myself it was none of my business, that I should just go back to bed and let Douglas deal with it when he got home. But the banging wouldn't stop, and after 15 minutes of listening to it, I couldn't take it anymore. I put on my rain jacket and grabbed the flashlight I kept in my junk drawer, the heavy metal one my dad had given me when I first moved out on my own. The rain hit me sideways the second I stepped outside, soaking through my pajama pants in seconds. I climbed over the low fence between our yards. Douglas didn't have a gate on my side, and my bare feet squelched in the muddy grass as I made my way to the shed. The door was swinging wildly, and I had to time it right to grab the handle without getting smacked in the face. When I finally caught it and pulled it fully open, my flashlight beam swept across the interior, and for a second I thought I was seeing things wrong, that the rain was distorting my vision somehow. The walls were completely covered, floor to ceiling, with laminated pieces of paper arranged in perfect rows, like some kind of demented gallery. I stepped inside just enough to get out of the rain, and that's when I realized what I was looking at. Missing person flyers, dozens and dozens of them. They weren't random or chaotic. Each flyer was meticulously placed with exactly 2 inches between them, held up by small brass pins that gleamed in my flashlight beam. Some of the faces looking back at me were familiar from news stories I half remembered. A college student from the state university who'd vanished after a party 3 years ago. A mother of 2 who disappeared from a grocery store parking lot. A teenage boy whose bike was found abandoned by the river. But most were strangers, their smiling photos clearly pulled from social media or family albums, frozen in happier moments before they became statistics. Underneath each flyer, in Douglas's cramped handwriting on strips of white label tape, were dates and locations written in red ink: November 3, 2018, Riverside Mall, or August 17, 2016, Greenwood Park, or January 22, 2024, corner of Madison and 3rd. My flashlight beam was shaking as I moved it across the walls, trying to process what I was seeing. In the corner, there was a metal filing cabinet with labels on each drawer, years going back over a decade. The top of the cabinet had a stack of newspapers, all folded to articles about missing persons, with certain sentences highlighted in yellow. I pulled open the top drawer of the filing cabinet with trembling fingers, and inside were manila folders, each one labeled with a name that matched the flyers on the walls. The first folder I grabbed belonged to a woman named Grace Holloway, who disappeared 2 years ago from a coffee shop downtown. Inside were printed screenshots of her social media profiles, photos that looked like they'd been taken from a distance showing her walking to her car or entering her apartment building, receipts from places she'd shopped, even what appeared to be a handwritten schedule of her daily routine. There was a map with red X marks at various locations around town, and at the bottom of the folder, a clear plastic sleeve containing a silver bracelet with a small charm shaped like a butterfly. My brain was screaming at me to run, to get out of there immediately, but I couldn't stop myself from reaching for another folder. This one was for a man named Robert Chu, missing since 2016, and it contained the same type of surveillance-like photos, the same obsessive documentation, and in the plastic sleeve at the back, a leather wallet with Robert's driver's license still inside. The sound of a car engine cutting through the storm made my entire body go rigid. Headlights swept across the side of the shed as Douglas's Camry pulled into his driveway, earlier than I'd expected him back. I shoved the folders back into the drawer and pushed it closed, but the metal made a loud screech that seemed to echo even over the rain. There was no time to get back to my house. I could already hear his car door slamming and his footsteps on the wet driveway. I did the only thing I could think of and pressed myself against the wall behind the door, trying to control my breathing as Douglas's silhouette appeared in the doorway. He stood there for what felt like forever, rain dripping off his jacket, head moving slowly from side to side like he was examining every inch of his collection. Then he spoke, not loudly but clear enough that I could hear every word over the storm. "I know someone's been in here. Things have been moved." He took a step inside and I could smell him. That mixture of hardware store dust and something medicinal, like hydrogen peroxide. His hand reached for a flashlight hanging on a hook right next to where I was hiding, his fingers inches from my face. Just then, a massive crack of thunder shook the entire shed, and the wind gusted so hard that it ripped the door from Douglas's grip and slammed it fully open against the outer wall, right where I was hidden. The door hit me hard in the shoulder, and I couldn't help the gasp that escaped my mouth. but the sound was completely swallowed by another roll of thunder and the shrieking wind. Douglas cursed and struggled to pull the door closed against the storm, giving me the 3 seconds I needed. I slipped out behind the door and into the rain, crouching low and moving as fast as I could toward the fence. I heard him yell something, but the storm was so loud I couldn't make out the words. I practically dove over the fence, landing hard in my own yard, and scrambled on my hands and knees to my back door. My fingers were so numb from the cold rain that I dropped my keys twice before managing to get inside. I locked the door, then the deadbolt, then shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I spent the rest of that night sitting on my bathroom floor with my phone in my hand, trying to decide whether to call 911. What would I even say? That my neighbor had a creepy collection of missing person flyers. That wasn't illegal. The personal items in those folders, though, the surveillance photos, those had to mean something. But I had no proof, no photos of my own, and I'd been trespassing in his shed. Around 4 a.m, I finally worked up the courage to peek through my bedroom blinds. Douglas was standing in his backyard, perfectly still in the rain, facing my house. He stayed there for another hour until the storm finally started to die down, then walked back to his shed and secured it with what looked like 3 new padlocks. The next morning, I called in sick to work again and drove straight to the police station. I told them everything, even admitted to trespassing, but the detective who took my statement seemed more concerned about my breaking and entering than anything else. He said they'd look into it, but without evidence of actual crimes, there wasn't much they could do about someone collecting newspaper clippings in their own shed. I packed my things that same afternoon, throwing everything into boxes without even wrapping the breakable stuff, just needing to get out of there as fast as possible. While I was loading my car, Douglas came out of his house and walked over, that mechanical smile plastered on his face. He asked if I was moving, and when I mumbled something about finding a place closer to work, he nodded slowly and said it was probably for the best, that the neighborhood could be dangerous for young women living alone. Then he handed me something, a missing person flyer fresh off a printer, with my photo from my social media profile staring back at me. Underneath the photo, in bold letters, it read, "Missing coming soon," with today's date written in his familiar red ink. I just stood there, unable to move or speak, while he walked back to his house whistling some old tune I didn't recognize. I drove straight to my parents' house 3 hours away and didn't stop shaking until I crossed the county line. I stayed with them for 2 weeks before finding a new apartment in their city, and I never went back to collect my security deposit or the few things I'd left behind. About a month later, I was finally starting to sleep through the night again when I saw a news article that made my whole body go numb. A woman named Claire Brennan had disappeared from Cedar Heights, last seen at a gas station about 6 blocks from my old rental house. The article mentioned that she was new to the area, lived alone, and had just started a job at a dental office downtown. But what really got me was the photo they used. I recognized it immediately as one I'd seen in Douglas's shed, already laminated and labeled with a date that was still 2 weeks in the future, when I'd seen it that night in November. I called the detective who'd taken my statement, gave him Claire's name and every detail I could remember, but he just said they'd add it to the file. They questioned Douglas apparently, even searched his shed with his permission, but found nothing except what the detective described as an extensive collection of public news materials related to his hobby of following missing persons cases. 2 more people disappeared from Cedar Heights over the next year, both young professionals who'd recently moved to the area, and Douglas still lives in that house. Still locks his shed every night at 9:15, probably with new folders and new photos that nobody will ever believe exist. People warn you about the dangers of living alone after a divorce, but nobody tells you how vulnerable you become when you're desperate for human connection. At 38, I found myself signing a lease for a small rental house on Sycamore Lane in early March of 2023, my belongings still packed in boxes that smelled like the marriage I'd just escaped. The neighborhood seemed perfect, Quiet streets, mature oak trees, the kind of place where people still walked their dogs in the evening and waved at each other from their driveways. I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed to start over, away from the suffocating memories of my failed relationship with Amanda and the endless therapy sessions that couldn't save us. The first week was all about unpacking and trying to make the empty rooms feel less like a reminder of everything I'd lost. My furniture looked wrong in the new space, like actors on the wrong stage, and I spent hours rearranging things just to feel like I had some control over something in my life. I met Diane on my 4th day there, when she appeared at my door with a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil and a smile that seemed genuine enough to lower my guard. She must have been in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that suggested she worked from home. Comfortable sweatpants and an oversized cardigan despite the warming weather. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Daniel," she said, and I remember being surprised she already knew my name, though I figured the landlord must have mentioned it or maybe she'd seen my mail. The lasagna she brought was incredible. Layers of homemade pasta and a meat sauce that reminded me of Sunday dinners from childhood, and when I returned her dish the next day, she invited me in for coffee. Her house was the mirror image of mine but felt lived in, with photos covering every surface and the smell of vanilla candles mixing with something baking in the oven. She talked about the neighborhood gossip while refilling my cup 3 times, mentioning how the previous tenant of my house had left suddenly in the middle of the night, which she laughed off as probably just breaking a lease the wrong way. Over the next few weeks, Diane became a constant presence in my new routine, always appearing at just the right moments with exactly what I needed. When I came home exhausted from a particularly brutal day at the accounting firm, she'd knock with takeout from my favorite Thai place, pad ki mao with extra basil, just how I liked it, though I couldn't remember ever mentioning my preference to her. She helped me set up my home office, suggesting I put my desk by the window facing east because morning people like you work better with natural light. And somehow she was right about me being a morning person. The thing is, I'd been working remotely since the divorce, keeping odd hours to avoid thinking too much, so there was no way she could have noticed my schedule from normal neighbor observations. She even brought over a small potted orchid one afternoon, saying it would brighten up my workspace, and mentioned offhandedly that Amanda had never appreciated how hard I worked to provide for us. That stopped me cold, because I knew I hadn't told her my ex-wife's name. The little intrusions started to add up like drops of water forming a flood I couldn't quite see yet. One evening, she texted me. I'd given her my number for emergencies, asking if I needed anything from the grocery store since she was heading out, and she listed items I was actually out of. Milk, eggs, that specific brand of whole grain bread I always bought, even the protein powder I used for my morning shakes. When I mentioned I'd been having trouble with my laptop running slowly, she showed up the next day with a USB drive containing the exact software I needed for my work, plus some extras she thought I might find useful. She knew I was allergic to shellfish without me ever mentioning it, always steering restaurant recommendations away from seafood places. Once she commented on how much better I looked since I'd stopped taking those anxiety medications that clearly weren't working anyway, but I kept my prescription bottles in my bathroom medicine cabinet, and she'd only ever been in my living room and kitchen. The moment that changed everything happened on a Saturday in early June, when Diane invited me over for dinner to meet her book club friends. Been hesitant, but figured it would be good to socialize, maybe meet more people in the neighborhood beyond just her. The dinner conversation was flowing normally, until one of her friends, a woman named Carol with thick glasses and a nervous laugh, mentioned she was a therapist at a practice downtown. "Oh, you must know Dr. Melissa Thornton then," Diane said casually while passing the salad. "She works at the same building, specializes in couples counseling. Daniel's ex-wife Amanda sees her every Wednesday at 4. The table went quiet, and I felt my fork slip from my fingers because not only had I never told Diane about Amanda's therapy, but those sessions were supposed to be from after our separation, something Amanda had started on her own. Carol looked confused and said she didn't think she should be discussing other doctors' patients, while I sat there trying to process how Diane could possibly know something that specific. I excused myself early that night, claiming a work deadline. But really, I needed to get away from Diane and think through everything clearly. Back in my house, I started making a list of everything she knew that she shouldn't. My social security number. She'd mentioned the last 4 digits once while joking about identity theft. My mother's maiden name. Brought it up when discussing family histories. The password to my Netflix account. She'd recommended shows that only appeared on my personal algorithm. And even the fact that I'd been browsing online dating profiles but hadn't messaged anyone yet. The more I wrote, the more my chest tightened with a feeling I hadn't experienced since the worst days of my marriage. That sensation of being watched, studied, like someone was taking notes on my life. I changed all my passwords that night, using my phone's data instead of my home Wi-Fi, and even put tape over my laptop camera, feeling paranoid but unable to shake the certainty that somehow she was monitoring everything I did. Monday morning, I called a locksmith while Diane was supposedly at her weekly yoga class, something she'd mentioned several times but I'd never actually seen her leave for. The locksmith, a young guy named Tommy with sleeves of tattoos and a reassuring professional demeanor, changed all 3 locks and installed a deadbolt on the back door. While he worked, he made small talk about the neighborhood, mentioning he'd done a lot of work on this street over the years. "Funny thing," he said while testing the new keys. "I changed these same locks about 8 months ago for the previous tenant. Same request too, wanted everything changed immediately. Seemed pretty spooked about something." He handed me the new keys and advised me to consider a security system, maybe some cameras, which felt less paranoid and more practical after hearing about my predecessor. I spent the rest of that day working from a coffee shop downtown, unable to focus but needing to be away from the house while I processed everything. When I finally returned home that evening, there was a note taped to my door in Diane's distinctive handwriting, all loops and careful cursive like someone who'd won penmanship awards in school. "Daniel, noticed you had someone working on your door today. Hope everything's okay. Made extra portions of that chicken marsala you love. It's in your fridge. D." My blood turned to ice because I knew I'd locked the door when I left, and the new deadbolt was still engaged when I got back. Inside, sure enough, there was a covered plate in my refrigerator, still warm like it had just been placed there. I searched the entire house, checking windows, looking for any sign of how she'd gotten in, but everything was exactly as I'd left it except for that single plate of food. The chicken was even prepared without mushrooms, accommodating a preference I'd developed after a bad food poisoning incident 3 years ago that I'd never discussed with anyone in this neighborhood. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every creak and shadow, convinced I'd hear her trying the new locks or see her face at my bedroom window. Around 3 in the morning, my laptop suddenly brightened on my desk, the screen waking up despite being closed. And I saw notification after notification popping up on my phone about password reset attempts on accounts I'd forgotten I even had. My old MySpace page, a defunct dating profile from 2015, even my college alumni portal were all sending security alerts. Then my phone started showing me as active on WhatsApp, though I wasn't touching it, and I watched in horror as the typing indicator appeared in my conversation with my brother in Colorado. The message that sent itself said, "Everything's fine here, just can't sleep," which was technically true but not something I'd typed. I immediately turned off my Wi-Fi router and everything stopped. But when I looked at the available networks on my phone, there it was at the top of the list with full signal strength. "Welcome home, Daniel." The next morning, I knocked on Diane's door, determined to confront her despite not knowing exactly what I'd say or what proof I really had beyond circumstantial strangeness. She answered wearing an apron covered in flour, classical music playing softly from somewhere inside her house, looking every bit the harmless neighbor except for the way her eyes lit up like she'd been expecting me. "Daniel, perfect timing. I just pulled banana bread out of the oven. Your favorite with extra walnuts but no chocolate chips. Just how you mentioned to your mother on the phone last week." I hadn't told her about that call, had made it from my car parked outside the office building specifically for privacy. When I asked her about the Wi-Fi network with my name, She tilted her head with this concerned expression that seemed practiced, rehearsed. "Oh, honey, that's been there since before you moved in. The previous tenant was also named Daniel. Daniel Brennan. Such a coincidence, right? I never got around to changing it after he left. Is it bothering you? I can update it if you'd like, though I'll need to reset all my smart home devices." The explanation was perfectly reasonable, except I'd looked up the previous tenant out of curiosity. His name was Christopher Vaughn. I decided to leave that very day, not permanently, but just to get some distance and clarity. Threw together a bag with a week's worth of clothes and my laptop, telling myself I'd stay at a hotel near my office while I figured out next steps. Maybe contacted a lawyer or the police, though I wasn't sure what crime I'd report exactly. As I loaded my car, Diane stood on her lawn watering plants that looked perfectly hydrated already, watching me with this serene smile like she knew something I didn't. "Taking a little trip?" she called out, and when I didn't respond, she added, "Drive safe, Daniel. That construction on Highway 47 can be brutal this time of day. Take Riverside Drive instead, trust me." I hadn't mentioned which direction I was going, but she was right. There was construction on my usual route to downtown. At the hotel that night, 30 miles from Sycamore Lane, I finally felt like I could breathe again. I even laughed at myself a little, wondering if I was overreacting. If maybe she was just a lonely older woman with boundary issues and a few lucky guesses. Then I opened my laptop to do some work and found a new folder on my desktop labeled Memories, filled with photos I'd never seen before. Pictures of me sleeping in my bed taken from different angles, screenshots of my private conversations, even a video file of me singing in the shower from just that morning. The police took my report but seemed skeptical, especially when I admitted I had no idea how she'd gotten the photos or accessed my devices. They said they'd send someone to talk to her, but without concrete evidence of breaking and entering or explicit threats, there wasn't much they could do. I ended up breaking my lease, losing my security deposit but gaining peace of mind, and moved across town to a modern apartment building with security cameras, key card access, and a doorman named Paul who took his job seriously. For weeks afterward, I'd still get texts from unknown numbers with little details only she would know. Reminders to take my vitamins, warnings about traffic on my new commute, recipes for dishes I'd mentioned craving years ago. Eventually, they stopped. Or maybe I just got better at ignoring them. Last month, out of curiosity and against my better judgment, I drove past Sycamore Lane and saw a moving truck in front of my old house. There was a young couple carrying boxes inside, looking excited about their new beginning. And Diane was already there with what looked like a casserole dish, that same welcoming smile on her face. I wanted to warn them but knew how crazy I'd sound, so I just drove away, though I sometimes check the local news, waiting to see their names appear in a story I hope never gets written. February changed everything for me, though it started out like any other month in that old brick building on Pine Street. My 27th birthday had just passed in January, and I'd been living alone in my third-floor apartment for about 2 months, finally making enough at the accounting firm downtown to afford a place without roommates. The apartment wasn't much to brag about, just a one-bedroom with creaky hardwood floors and windows that rattled whenever trucks rumbled past. But having my own space meant everything to me after years of sharing kitchens and bathrooms with strangers. The building itself had character, one of those pre-war constructions where you could hear every footstep, every conversation, every toilet flush from the neighboring units. The guy above me had moved in maybe 3 weeks after I did, and I only knew him as Nathan because that's what the super called him when they were fixing a leak in the hallway one afternoon. The footsteps started as something I barely noticed, just another layer of noise in a building full of sounds. But after a few days, I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Whenever I walked from my bedroom to the kitchen, I'd hear the same path traced above me, the floorboards groaning in an identical rhythm. When I'd settle into my desk chair to work from home on Fridays, his chair would scrape against the floor directly overhead, like clockwork. I started experimenting, taking random routes through my apartment, walking in circles around my coffee table, stopping suddenly in the middle of the room. And each time, those footsteps above would mirror mine perfectly, never missing a beat. The rational part of my brain kept insisting our apartments must have the same layout, that we probably just had similar schedules since we both seemed to work from home, both stayed up late binge-watching shows until the early hours. The first note appeared on a Monday morning, slipped under my door while I was in the shower. Just a plain index card with neat handwriting in blue ink. Hope you're having a good morning. It's nice knowing someone else keeps the same weird hours as me. Nathan from upstairs. I actually smiled reading it, thinking how sweet it was that he'd reached out. And I spent the rest of the day drafting different responses in my head, though I never actually wrote one back. 2 days later, another note. The coffee shop on the corner makes the best blueberry muffins, just thought you should know. This time I left a thank you note taped to his door, keeping things friendly but brief. The notes became a regular thing. Every few days I'd find another one. Always cheerful, always signed the same way, talking about restaurant recommendations or commenting on the weather or making jokes about the couple next door and their Sunday morning arguments. For about 3 weeks, the notes felt like a bright spot in my routine, something that made living alone feel less isolating. Nathan seemed considerate, never knocked on my door directly, never tried to corner me in the hallway. Just these little written hellos that I could respond to or ignore as I pleased. But then the tone shifted, so gradually I almost didn't notice at first. "You looked tired yesterday when you came home from work," one said, which seemed odd since I hadn't seen him that day, hadn't passed him in the hallway or anything. Another one read, "That phone call last night sounded stressful. Hope everything's okay," which made my chest tighten because I'd been talking to my mom about some personal stuff, speaking quietly in my bedroom with the door closed. The footsteps above me seemed louder now, more deliberate, and sometimes I'd hear him moving around at 3, 4 in the morning, pacing directly over wherever I happened to be. I started keeping track of the notes in a journal, trying to make sense of what was happening, documenting every strange detail. "You're not alone up here," said one that arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, and something about that phrasing made my skin prickle with unease. Not "you're not alone," which could mean he was just being neighborly, but up here like we were somehow sharing the same space, like the floor between us didn't exist. I began avoiding my apartment during the day, staying late at the office, taking longer routes home, anything to minimize the time I spent beneath those matching footsteps. But the notes kept coming, sometimes 2 in a single day, commenting on things that made no sense. "Your laugh is lovely. You should do it more often," when I hadn't laughed in days. "That green dress really suits you," when I'd worn it inside my apartment with the blinds drawn. The breaking point came on a Saturday night in late February, when I decided to confront him, or at least try to understand what was happening. I'd had a couple glasses of wine for courage, and marched up the stairs to the 4th floor, my heart hammering against my ribs as I stood outside his door. I knocked 3 times, firm but not aggressive, and waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out his name. Told him I knew he was home because I could literally hear him walking around up there 5 minutes ago. Still nothing, but I could hear movement inside, slow, careful footsteps approaching the door. I saw the peephole darken as he looked through it, and I stood there staring right back, waiting for him to open up, to explain himself, to do something. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, me standing in that dimly lit hallway, him watching me through that tiny lens, until finally I heard him step back and walk away, his footsteps fading into the depths of his apartment. That night changed something between us, like I'd broken some unspoken rule by going to his door. The notes stopped completely, no more index cards under my door, no more friendly observations about my life. But the footsteps got worse, more aggressive somehow, stomping instead of walking, following me from room to room with a determination that felt almost angry. I'd be brushing my teeth and hear him directly above my bathroom, the ceiling creaking under his weight. I'd crawl into bed and immediately hear his bed frame scraping against the floor overhead, positioning himself right above where I lay. I stopped sleeping properly, would doze off on the couch instead of my bed, But even then, I'd wake up to the sound of him settling onto his couch too, the springs groaning in perfect synchronization with mine. I called the super, Jerry, told him something weird was going on with Nathan upstairs, but Jerry just laughed and said Nathan was a model tenant, quiet guy, worked in IT, always paid rent on time. I tried explaining about the footsteps, the notes, the way he seemed to know everything about my daily routine. But Jerry looked at me like I was losing it, suggested maybe I was stressed from work. That apartment living took some getting used to. I even called the cops once when the footsteps were particularly bad. Nathan pacing in tight circles above my bed at 4 in the morning. But they said, unless he was threatening me directly or trying to break in, there wasn't much they could do about a neighbor being noisy. The female officer did seem concerned about the notes though. Told me to keep them all, document everything, just in case things escalated. Then came the night I heard my name through the vent, and everything I'd been trying to rationalize came crashing down. It was a Friday, around midnight, and I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the sound of Nathan moving around upstairs. The footsteps had stopped about 10 minutes earlier, and I was just starting to relax when I heard it, soft but unmistakable, drifting down through the heating vent next to my bed. "Jessica," the voice whispered, drawing out each syllable like he was tasting the word. "Jessica, Jessica, Jessica," over and over, this quiet chanting that made my whole body go rigid with fear. I pressed my ear against the vent, thinking maybe I was imagining it, but no. It was definitely coming from above, his voice floating down through the metal ductwork, sometimes laughing softly between repetitions of my name. I grabbed my phone and started recording, needing proof that this was really happening, that I wasn't going crazy like everyone seemed to think. The recording picked up his voice clearly, that sing-song way he said my name, the little humming sounds he made between words. Then he said something that made my blood turn to ice water. "I know you're listening, Jessica. I can hear your breathing. We breathe together, you and me, in and out, in and out." And the horrifying thing was, he was right. I could hear his breathing through the vent, and without meaning to, I'd synchronized my own breathing with his, our inhales and exhales matching perfectly. I held my breath, trying to break the pattern, and immediately heard him laughing. This quiet, delighted sound like we were playing a game and I'd just made a really good move. That was it for me. I couldn't stay there another second. I threw on sweatpants and a hoodie over my pajamas, shoved my phone and wallet into my pockets and ran out of my apartment, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night in my car in a Walmart parking lot, calling every friend I could think of, trying to find someone who'd let me crash at their place for a few days. My friend Brittany finally answered, said I could stay with her as long as I needed, and I drove straight there, showing up at her door at 3 in the morning looking absolutely wrecked. I played her the recording from my phone, and the look on her face told me everything. This wasn't normal, wasn't something I was imagining. This was genuinely terrifying, and I needed to get out of that apartment immediately. I never went back alone after that night. Brittany and her boyfriend came with me that Sunday afternoon to pack up my stuff, and Nathan must have known we were there because the footsteps started the moment we walked in, following us from room to room as we threw my belongings into boxes and trash bags. At one point, Brittany's boyfriend Mike got fed up and started yelling at the ceiling, telling Nathan to cut it out, that we knew what he was doing, that the cops had been notified. The footsteps stopped for about 30 seconds, then resumed, but slower, more deliberate, like he was savoring his last chance to mirror my movements. We got everything out in under 2 hours, and as I was doing a final walkthrough, I found one last note that must have been slipped under the door while we were packing. "You'll always be right below me, no matter where you go." I kept that note, added it to my collection of evidence, though I never did anything with it. Never pressed charges or anything. Just wanted to forget the whole thing ever happened. I broke my lease, lost my security deposit, but it was worth it to get away from there, to sleep without wondering if someone was standing directly above me, breathing in sync with my every breath. Last July, at 32 years old, I finally had enough saved up to move into Westbrook Gardens, one of those gated communities you see advertised with perfect lawns and smiling families. I'd been living in cramped apartments since college, dealing with noisy neighbors and broken elevators, so this felt like a massive upgrade. The house wasn't huge, just a modest 2-story with beige siding and a decent backyard, but it was mine. I remember driving through those security gates for the first time with my U-Haul, feeling like I'd finally made it somewhere in life. The guard, an older guy named Harold with thick glasses and a permanent squint, gave me this strange little nod and wrote something down on his clipboard. I didn't think much of it then, just figured he was logging new residents or something routine like that. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for after years of apartment living. Quiet streets, kids riding bikes, people walking their dogs in the evening. On my third night there, while I was still surrounded by boxes and eating takeout Chinese food straight from the container, my doorbell rang around 8. Standing there was this group of 5 people, all probably in their 60s or 70s, wearing matching yellow reflective vests with Neighborhood Watch printed across the back. The woman in front, who introduced herself as Dorothy, had this oversized smile and held a plate of chocolate chip cookies that looked store-bought but were arranged on a fancy glass plate. Behind her stood 2 men and 2 other women, all holding walkie-talkies on their belts and carrying these leather-bound notebooks. Dorothy explained they were the official Westbrook Gardens Neighborhood Watch, established in 1987, and they wanted to personally welcome me and invite me to join their group. I invited them in because it seemed rude not to, even though I really just wanted to finish my lo mein and unpack my kitchen stuff. They all filed into my living room and sat down on my one-assembled couch without being asked, arranging themselves in this weirdly precise formation, like they'd done this exact thing hundreds of times before. Dorothy did most of the talking, explaining how they met every Monday and Friday at 7 sharp, and that they had a special midnight meeting once a month for what she called priority matters. The way she said it, emphasizing those 2 words while the others nodded in perfect unison, made me uncomfortable. One of the men, who never actually introduced himself but had a name tag that said Eugene, kept writing in his notebook the entire time, his pen moving even when nobody was talking. I tried to peek at what he was writing, but he'd angle the notebook away whenever I shifted my position. They stayed for exactly 30 minutes, and I mean exactly, because when Dorothy's watch beeped at 8:30, all 5 of them stood up simultaneously like they were controlled by the same brain. Before leaving, Dorothy handed me a thick packet of papers, maybe 40 pages, all about neighborhood watch protocols and responsibilities. She said I should read through everything and let her know by Friday if I wanted to join, adding that participation was strongly encouraged for community harmony. The phrase stuck with me because of how she said it, like she was reciting something she'd memorized. After they left, I flipped through the packet and found pages of rules about patrol schedules, incident reporting procedures, and this whole section about maintaining neighborhood standards that seemed weirdly aggressive for a volunteer group of retirees. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to get familiar with the area and maybe meet some neighbors who weren't part of the geriatric patrol squad. That's when I started noticing the symbols. At first, I thought it was just a weird coincidence, but every single house had this same marking, carved into the wood near their mailbox post. It looked like 3 intersecting circles with a triangle in the middle, about the size of a quarter, carved deep enough that it had to be intentional. Some looked fresh and clean, others were painted over but still visible underneath, and a few were so old the wood had darkened around them. I checked at least 20 houses on my street and the next one over, and every single one had it. Mine didn't, which suddenly made me feel exposed, like my house was advertising that I didn't belong there yet. I spent the rest of the week avoiding Dorothy and her crew, which turned out to be harder than expected in a gated community. They seemed to be everywhere, always walking in pairs with their vests and walkie-talkies, always taking notes on those leather notebooks. On Wednesday, I was coming home from work when I saw Eugene and another watch member standing in front of my house, just staring at my mailbox. When they saw me pulling into my driveway, They waved like nothing was weird about two old men examining my property at 6 in the evening. Eugene actually walked over to my car window and asked if I'd had a chance to review the packet, reminding me that Friday was the deadline to respond. His breath smelled like mothballs and something medicinal, and he stood way too close to my car door, basically trapping me until I promised I'd look at it that night. Friday came and I still hadn't given Dorothy an answer, mostly because the whole thing gave me the creeps, and I figured they'd just leave me alone if I ignored them long enough. Around 7 that evening, right when their regular meeting would be starting, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw Dorothy standing there alone. No smile this time, just this blank expression that made her look like a completely different person. I didn't answer, just stayed quiet and waited for her to leave. She rang the bell 2 more times, then knocked with this slow, methodical rhythm that went on for about 30 seconds. Then she spoke, loud enough that I could hear her clearly through the door, saying that my absence was noted and that the community was disappointed in my lack of participation. She used that exact word, disappointed, drawing it out like she was talking to a misbehaving child. After she finally left, I watched through my window as she walked down my driveway and met up with the rest of the watch group who had been waiting by the street the entire time. They huddled together for a minute, all of them looking back at my house, then dispersed in different directions like they were following some predetermined route. That night, I couldn't sleep well, kept hearing noises outside, footsteps on the sidewalk, whispers that might have been the wind or might have been something else. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and went to check my security camera footage from earlier, just to make sure I wasn't being paranoid. What I saw made me wish I'd never bought this house. Starting at exactly midnight, there were 12 people standing at the end of my driveway, all wearing those yellow reflective vests, all facing my house, completely motionless for 1 hour and 13 minutes before they all turned and walked away at the same time. Saturday morning, I called the security company that managed the gates, trying to report what happened without sounding completely insane. The woman on the phone, who sounded bored and half asleep, told me that the Neighborhood Watch was a sanctioned group with full authority to patrol the community at any hour. When I pushed back, saying that standing in my driveway at midnight wasn't patrolling, she got quiet for a moment, then said something that chilled me more than seeing those people on my camera. She said that according to their records, I was already a registered member of the Neighborhood Watch as of Friday night, and that my initiation period would last 90 days. I told her I never signed up for anything, never agreed to join, but she insisted their records showed my verbal consent was given to Dorothy at 7:15 the previous evening, right around the time she was knocking on my door that I never answered. I spent the rest of Saturday researching Westbrook Gardens online, trying to find anyone else who'd had similar experiences, but every review was glowing. Every social media post showed happy families and community barbecues. The only odd thing I found was a death notice from 2015 about a resident named Andrew Garrett who had died in a house fire, specifically noted as living at my exact address. More searching revealed that in the past 20 years, my specific house had changed owners 7 times, which seemed excessive even for a transient area. Each previous owner had lived there less than a year, and I couldn't find any of them online afterward, like they just vanished after moving out. That afternoon, while I was deep in this rabbit hole of research, my doorbell rang again, but this time it was just a package delivery, except I hadn't ordered anything. Inside the package was a yellow reflective vest with my last name already printed on the back, a leather-bound notebook exactly like the ones they all carried, a walkie-talkie preset to Channel 7, and a small wood-carving tool with a note that simply said, "For your mailbox, complete by Monday." The precision of the threat hidden in that mundane instruction made me realize I was dealing with something far more organized and dangerous than a group of bored retirees. That night, I started packing essential items into my car, planning to stay at a hotel until I could figure out what to do. Maybe contact a lawyer or even the police outside the community. But when I tried to leave around 10 that night, the security gate wouldn't open. Harold, the guard from my first day, walked over to my car with that same strange squint, and informed me that new watch members weren't permitted to leave the community during their initiation period, except for work-related purposes, and only then with written documentation of their employment schedule. I abandoned my car and walked back to my house, my mind racing through options that all seemed equally useless against whatever this was. The moment I got inside, I called my brother in Arizona, told him everything, and asked him to come get me, to bring the police if necessary. He said he'd drive through the night and be there by morning. I stayed up all night with every light in my house on, baseball bat in hand, watching those security cameras like my life depended on it. At exactly midnight, they came again, but this time there were at least 20 of them, maybe more, all standing in that same perfect formation at the end of my driveway. Dorothy was in front this time, and even through the grainy camera footage, I could see she was holding something that looked like a folder or clipboard, moving her mouth like she was reading something out loud to the others. My brother arrived at 7:30 Sunday morning with 2 cops from the county sheriff's department, and that's when everything finally broke open. The guards at the gate tried to refuse them entry, citing community bylaws, but the cops weren't having any of it and threatened to arrest Harold for obstruction. Once they got to my house and I showed them the security footage, things moved fast. Turns out the FBI had been monitoring Westbrook Gardens for 2 years, suspecting it was some kind of cult that used the homeowners association as a front. The whole neighborhood watch thing was their recruitment method, and those who refused to join after buying property, there would face increasing harassment until they either joined or abandoned their homes, which the group would then buy through shell companies and resell to new potential members. The symbols, the midnight gatherings, the 90-day initiation period, it was all part of their indoctrination process. By noon, there were federal agents everywhere, arresting Dorothy and 43 other residents, including Harold and most of the watch group I'd met. They found detailed records in Dorothy's house showing 8 previous owners of my house who had all fled within their first year, and Andrew Garrett, the one who died in the fire, had apparently been trying to expose them to law enforcement. I gave my statement, packed everything I could fit in my brother's truck, and left that afternoon, not even bothering to properly close on selling the house, just wanting to get as far away as possible. The FBI agent handling my case called me a month later to say I'd likely saved myself from something much worse, as they'd found evidence of financial crimes, identity theft, and what he carefully called other concerning activities that he couldn't discuss. I took a massive financial loss on that house, but I'm alive, living in a normal apartment with normal neighbors who don't wear matching vests or stand in my driveway at midnight. And honestly, that's worth more than any dream house could ever be. When I moved into that cul-de-sac, it felt like stepping into one of those 2 perfect postcards you find in realtor offices. Every house looked nearly identical: beige paint, trimmed hedges, wreaths that changed with the season. I had been looking for somewhere quiet after ending a long-term relationship and quitting my job in the city. The idea of starting fresh somewhere peaceful sounded like exactly what I needed. The first morning after unpacking, I woke up to a knock on the door and found a woman in her 50s holding a casserole dish big enough to feed 6 people. She introduced herself as Mrs. Hayworth from across the street and said the neighbors were so thrilled to have me join their little community. That afternoon, 3 more people stopped by. There was a couple named Gina and Mark who lived next door, both wearing matching aprons from some local barbecue event, and an older man named Earl, who seemed to be in charge of the neighborhood watch. They all repeated the same line in slightly different tones. "We like to keep everyone close around here." At the time, I thought it was just small-town friendliness. They talked about a monthly potluck at the end of every month and insisted I come. Even when I said I was still settling in, they assured me they'd make room. It was hard not to feel a little pressured, but I told myself it was harmless. Within a week, I noticed something strange about how synchronized the neighborhood seemed. Trash cans rolled out at the exact same time. Lawns got mowed in perfect unison, right down to the sound of engines starting within seconds of each other. Even their mailboxes looked recently polished. I figured they were just the kind of people who took pride in appearances. But the more I watched, the more it felt rehearsed. Every time I pulled out of my driveway, at least one of them happened to be outside, waving, smiling, pretending to garden. It started to feel less like coincidence and more like surveillance. The first potluck came sooner than I expected. The whole cul-de-sac turned into a parade of folding tables, fairy lights, and slow cookers. Everyone brought something homemade and stood in a perfect circle like it was choreographed. When I showed up with a store-bought pie, a few people chuckled softly, not unkindly, but just enough to make me feel out of place. Mrs. Hayworth clapped me on the back and said, "You'll get the hang of it soon enough." That night, as I helped clean up, I caught Gina whispering something to Mark while glancing in my direction. She smiled when our eyes met. A little too wide, a little too long. After that night, the friendliness intensified. Whenever I went for a walk, someone would appear by chance. Earl would be sweeping his driveway, Mark would be trimming hedges, or Gina would step out just to water plants that were already soaked. Once I drove to a grocery store 2 towns over and came back to find a pie on my doorstep with a note that said, "We missed you today." The handwriting looked familiar. Neat loops like Mrs. Hayworth's, but the signature was unsigned. I told myself they were just trying to be kind, but the way they always knew where I had been made my chest feel tight every time I turned into that street. About a month later, I was coming home late from a weekend trip. Every house was dark except mine, where my porch light flickered even though I had never left it on. The motion sensor light across the street blinked too, as if reacting to something I couldn't see. As I stepped out of my car, I heard faint laughter, not loud but close enough to carry through the hedges. When I turned around, all the curtains in Earl's house were drawn except one narrow slit, and behind it, a shadow moved. I stood there for a while, pretending to look for my keys, waiting for whoever was watching to move away. The shadow didn't. It just stayed there, still, like it was waiting for me to go inside first. The next morning, I found a stack of flyers taped neatly to my front door. Each one was identical. Neighborhood potluck, attendance encouraged. What unsettled me most was that my name had been written by hand at the bottom of each flyer, in different handwriting. One looked like Earl's, another like Gina's, and one even had the same perfect loops as Mrs. Hayworth's notes. I tore them all down and threw them in the trash, but later that day, as I took out the bin, the flyers were back, folded neatly on top of the lid. Someone had been on my property again. That night, I locked every door and window before going to bed. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on my porch. The boards creaked in a slow, measured rhythm. One step, a pause, then another. I held my breath, too scared to move. After a few moments, the sound stopped, followed by the faint scrape of something sliding under my door. I waited until morning to check. On the floor lay an envelope, unmarked, sealed with tape. Inside was a single sheet of paper, every neighbor's handwriting combined into one chilling sentence. "We're so happy you finally fit in." I packed a bag that morning, convinced I was leaving. But before I could load my car, Mrs. Hayworth appeared on the sidewalk with her usual calm smile. She said she noticed my light had been on late and wanted to check in. Behind her, Earl leaned on his mailbox, pretending to read the paper. Gina waved from her porch. It was as if they had all appeared at once, positioned in a triangle around me. I forced a smile and told her I was visiting family. She tilted her head and said, "Good, family's important here." Then she gestured toward the envelope still on my porch. "We're so glad you got our note." That night, I checked into a cheap motel 15 miles away. When I turned on the television, a local commercial played, an advertisement for the Crestfield Homeowners Association, showing the same street I had just left. Everyone was there, smiling and waving, standing in front of their houses. For a split second, I thought I saw myself too. Same clothes, same hair, standing among them and smiling like I belonged. The screen glitched, and when it cleared, my image was gone. I called the police the next morning to request a welfare check on the neighborhood. The officer I spoke to said there was no record of a Crestfield court in that area, only a wooded lot with an old access road that hadn't been maintained for years. I even drove back to confirm it myself, and he was right. There was nothing there but overgrown grass and cracked pavement leading into the trees. No houses, no mailboxes, no neighbors. Just silence. I have since moved twice, and I still find things in my mailbox that I never ordered. Birthday cards signed by people I never met. Grocery flyers from a town that doesn't exist. The most recent envelope arrived last week. No return address. Inside was a short note written in the same mixture of handwritings as before. "We're so happy you never left." Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Grandma Eloise passed away on a Friday morning in April 2024, and by Sunday afternoon, I found myself sitting cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom closet, surrounded by decades of her life packed into cardboard boxes. My mother had asked me to help sort through everything since she could barely step into the house without breaking down. At 26, fresh out of a failed engagement and temporarily crashing at my parents' place in rural Virginia, I had nothing but time on my hands. Grandma and I had always been close, the kind of close where she would call me her little co-conspirator whenever we snuck extra dessert before dinner. She lived alone in that old farmhouse for 11 years after Grandpa Harold died, refusing to move despite everyone's concerns. The house smelled like her lavender hand cream and old books, and going through her things felt like reading her diary without permission. I expected to find old recipes, maybe some love letters from Grandpa, perhaps photographs from her years as a schoolteacher. What I did not expect was for my entire understanding of who she was to collapse within the span of a single afternoon. The first few boxes contained exactly what you would imagine. Report cards she had saved from students who had written sweet notes on the back, Christmas cards dating back to the 70s, receipts she had kept for absolutely no logical reason. I was actually smiling, shaking my head at how she had hoarded rubber bands in a mason jar, like they were precious gems. Then I pulled out a shoebox from the very back of her closet, hidden behind a stack of quilts she had sewn herself. It was heavier than it should have been, and the lid was secured with a thick rubber band that had nearly fused to the cardboard. When I finally pried it open, I found a bundle of documents wrapped in a faded silk scarf, the kind with hand-rolled edges that women wore in old Hollywood movies. There was a marriage certificate on top, yellowed and brittle, dated June 1961. The bride's name was Eloise Marie Compton, my grandmother's maiden name. But the groom was not Harold Weston, the man I had called Grandpa my entire life. The name typed in careful black letters was Vincent Agostino, and seeing it there made me feel like I had just stepped through a trap door into a room that was never supposed to exist. I sat there for a long time just staring at that certificate, trying to make it fit into the story of my grandmother that I had known my whole life. She married Grandpa Harold in 1965. I knew that because their anniversary was always a big deal, always celebrated with her famous lemon cake and too many candles. But this certificate said she had been married 4 years before that, to a man none of us had ever heard of. I carefully unfolded the other documents in the bundle, my fingers leaving smudges on paper that had not been touched in decades. There were photographs, small square ones with scalloped edges, the kind they used to take at photo booths. My grandmother, impossibly young, maybe 19 or 20, with victory rolls in her dark hair and red lipstick that photographed almost black. And next to her, a man with slicked back hair, a sharp jaw, and eyes that looked like they were keeping secrets even in a snapshot. He was handsome in a dangerous way, the kind of handsome that mothers warned their daughters about. On the back of one photo, in my grandmother's careful cursive, were the words, "V and me, Coney Island, June 1961. Beneath the photographs, I found newspaper clippings, brittle and brown at the edges, folded into small squares like someone had been hiding them for a very long time. The first one was from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, dated March 1963. The headline read, "Local businessman sought for questioning in warehouse fire." There was no photo, but the article mentioned a Vincent Agostino, age 24, believed to be connected to the Marano crime family operating out of Red Hook. 3 men had died in that fire. The article said investigators suspected arson, that the warehouse had been used as a front for illegal gambling operations, and that Agostino had not been seen since the night of the blaze. I read it 3 times, waiting for the words to change, waiting for some other Vincent Agostino to appear, a different man with the same name, a coincidence that would let me keep my grandmother intact. But the next clipping was worse. It was from 2 weeks later, a smaller article buried on page 6, reporting that Vincent Agostino was now considered a missing person. His car had been found abandoned near the docks in Staten Island, doors open, keys still in the ignition. There was blood on the front seat. He was never seen again. My hands moved on their own after that, pulling out more papers, more secrets. There was a letter, handwritten on plain white paper, no envelope, no date. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, nothing like my grandmother's elegant script. It read, "Ellie, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Do not look for me. Do not ask questions. Forget you ever knew my name. They will come asking and you must tell them nothing. You were never my wife, we never met. Burn this letter and everything else. I am sorry for what I brought into your life. V." She had not burned it. She had kept it for over 60 years, tucked away in this shoebox along with her marriage certificate and those photographs and those terrible newspaper clippings. I tried to imagine her as a young woman, barely 22 years old, receiving this letter, realizing that her husband was either dead or running for his life, and that she could never speak of him again. I tried to imagine the fear she must have felt, the grief she could not share with anyone, the weight of pretending he had never existed. At the very bottom of the shoebox, beneath everything else, I found a small spiral notebook with a faded green cover. It was a diary of sorts, though not quite, more like scattered notes written in my grandmother's handwriting at different times over many years. The first entry was dated April 1963, just weeks after Vincent disappeared. "Men came to the apartment today, 2 of them. They asked about V. I told them I did not know anyone by that name. They did not believe me. One of them grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave bruises. They said they would be back." I turned the page with shaking fingers. May 1963, moved to Virginia. Changed my name back to Compton. Told everyone I was a widow, that my husband died in Korea. No one questions a war widow. The entries continued, sparse but devastating. In 1965, she wrote about meeting Harold, a kind man who worked at the post office and brought her flowers every Sunday. In 1967, she wrote about their wedding, about how happy she was, about how she had finally started to feel safe. But then, in 1971, another entry. "A man came to the school today, said he was looking for an old friend named Ellie Agostino. I told him there was no one here by that name. He smiled at me before he left. He knew. They still know." I kept reading, unable to stop, each entry pulling me deeper into a life I never knew existed. The entries were not frequent. Sometimes years would pass between them, but they painted a picture of constant, quiet terror. In 1978, she wrote about a black sedan that parked outside their house for 3 days straight, before finally driving away. She never told Harold. In 1985, when my mother was a teenager, someone broke into their car and rifled through the glove compartment, but took nothing of value. They were looking for something, my grandmother wrote, or sending a message. I do not know which is worse. In 1993, she received a sympathy card in the mail after her own mother's funeral. It was unsigned, postmarked from Brooklyn, and inside someone had written only, "Our condolences to the Agostino family." She kept that card too, pressed between the pages of the notebook like a dried flower, a reminder of a threat that never quite went away. I realized then that my grandmother had spent her entire adult life looking over her shoulder, waiting for the past to finally catch up with her. The last entry in the notebook was dated just 3 years ago, in 2022. My grandmother's handwriting had grown shaky by then, the letters wobbly and uneven in a way that made my chest ache. I am 83 years old and I still check the locks twice every night. I still look at every unfamiliar car that drives down our road. Harold has been gone for over a decade now, and I am alone with this secret, the way I always knew I would be. Sometimes I think about telling the children, about leaving this box for them to find after I'm gone. But what good would it do? The men who killed Vincent are probably dead themselves by now. The Moranos are gone, broken up by the FBI in the 80s. There is no one left to be afraid of. And yet, I am still afraid. I have been afraid for 60 years, and I do not know how to stop. Maybe when I die, the fear will finally die with me. Maybe that is the only way it ends. I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest, and I sat there in my dead grandmother's closet and cried for the terrified young woman she had been, and for all the years she spent carrying this weight alone. I do not know how long I stayed in that closet. The light coming through the bedroom window had shifted from afternoon gold to the soft gray of early evening by the time I finally pulled myself together. I put everything back in the shoebox, the certificate, the photographs, the clippings, the letter, the notebook, and I carried it downstairs to the kitchen table. My mother was coming back the next morning to continue sorting through things, and I had a decision to make. Did I tell her? Did I show her this box and watch her entire understanding of her own mother collapse the way mine had? Grandma Eloise had kept this secret for over 60 years. She had protected her family from this knowledge, had borne the weight of it alone so that they would never have to be afraid the way she was afraid. Part of me wanted to honor that sacrifice, to take this box out to the backyard and burn it the way Vincent had asked her to do all those years ago. But another part of me, a louder part, needed to know more. I needed to understand what had really happened to Vincent Agostino, and whether the threat my grandmother feared her whole life had ever been real at all. I spent that night at the kitchen table with my laptop, falling down a rabbit hole of old newspaper archives and genealogy websites and true crime forums dedicated to organized crime in mid-century New York. The Morano family had been real. A small but violent outfit that operated out of Brooklyn from the late 40s until the FBI dismantled them in 1987. They were known for gambling, loan sharking, and arson for hire. Vincent Agostino's name appeared in a few digitized court documents from the era, listed as a known associate, but never formally charged with anything. His disappearance in March 1963 was mentioned in a true crime book about unsolved mob murders that someone had excerpted on a forum. The author speculated that Vincent had either been killed by the Moranos for skimming money, or that he had been an informant who was eliminated before he could testify. Either way, his body was never found. There was no closure, no resolution, just a young man who walked into the fog of history and never came back. And my grandmother, barely out of her teens, had been married to him for less than 2 years before he vanished. She had spent the rest of her life waiting for the people who killed him to come for her too. Around 2 in the morning, I found something that made me sit back in my chair and stare at the screen for a long time. It was a photograph in a digitized FBI file from the Morano investigation, released decades later under the Freedom of Information Act. The image was grainy, black and white, showing a group of men standing outside a social club in Red Hook sometime in the early 60s. Most of the faces were labeled with names I did not recognize, soldiers and associates long dead or imprisoned. But in the corner of the frame, partially cut off, was a young man in a dark coat looking directly at the camera. The label beneath him read, V. Agostino, unconfirmed. I zoomed in as much as the resolution would allow, and even through the blur of age and pixels, I recognized the sharp jaw, the slicked back hair, those eyes that seemed to be keeping secrets. It was him. It was really him. My grandmother had married that man, had shared a bed with him, had probably loved him in the desperate way young people love before they understand what love costs. And he had walked away from her into a world of violence and shadows and never come back. I decided that night to keep the shoebox. I did not burn it, and I did not show it to my mother. Not right away, at least. Instead, I put it in the trunk of my car and drove back to my parents' house, and I spent the next few weeks trying to figure out what to do with the weight of what I had learned. Eventually, I did tell my mother. I waited until a quiet Sunday afternoon when my father was out golfing, and I sat her down at the kitchen table and opened the box in front of her. She cried, of course. She asked questions I could not answer. She looked at the photographs of her mother as a young bride and said she did not recognize the woman in them. But she also said something that has stayed with me ever since. She said, "All those years I thought she was just anxious. I thought she was paranoid about nothing. But she was protecting us. She was carrying all of this so we would never have to. We decided together to keep the secret within our immediate family. There was no point in telling my aunts and uncles, no reason to shatter their image of Grandma Eloise when she had worked so hard to build it. The Moranos were gone. Vincent was gone. The only person left who had been afraid was gone too. We let the fear die with her, the way she had hoped it would. I still have the shoebox. It sits on the top shelf of my closet now, behind a stack of old yearbooks and photo albums from college. Sometimes late at night when I cannot sleep, I take it down and look through its contents again. I study the photographs of my grandmother as a young woman, trying to find some trace of the fear that would come to define her life. But all I see is hope. She looks so impossibly young in those pictures, so full of the belief that love can conquer anything. She did not know yet what Vincent was, or what he would bring into her life. She did not know that she would spend the next 6 decades checking locks and watching cars and flinching at unexpected knocks on the door. I think about her often now, not the grandmother I knew with her lemon cake and her lavender hand cream, but the frightened young woman who reinvented herself completely just to survive. She built a whole life out of silence and secrets, and she did it so well that none of us ever suspected a thing. I do not know if that makes her brave or tragic or both. But I know this. She loved us enough to carry this burden alone, and she was strong enough to never let it break her. That is the woman I choose to remember. That is the grandmother I will always love. A cream-colored envelope changed everything, though I did not know it yet when I pulled it from the mailbox 5 days after we buried Dad. March 2017 had been the worst month of my life up to that point. My father died of a heart attack in his recliner, alone in the Rochester apartment where he raised my sister and me after our mother walked out. I was 24, working at a small accounting firm downtown, and my sister Tessa had just turned 22, still finishing her nursing degree while pulling night shifts at an assisted living facility. We were broke, grieving, and completely unprepared to handle the logistics of death. Dad never talked about what he wanted for a funeral, never talked about money, never talked about anything personal really. His past was the one subject guaranteed to make him leave the room. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, none of them existed as far as we knew. He raised us like he had appeared from nowhere, a man without a history, and we stopped asking questions years ago because the silence that followed hurt too much. The letter inside that envelope came from Scottsdale, Arizona, written in elegant cursive on thick stationery that smelled faintly of lavender. A woman named Lorraine Prescott claimed to be our grandmother, our father's mother, someone whose existence he had hidden from us our entire lives. She wrote that she and her husband Donald had been searching for us for years, that our father cut off all contact when he left home decades ago, and they never understood why. She found out about his death through an obituary search online, and her letter overflowed with grief and regret and desperate hope. At the bottom, She included a phone number and a photograph of two silver-haired people standing in front of a beautiful Adobe-style house surrounded by desert flowers. I remember holding that photo in the dim kitchen light, boxes stacked around me, searching their faces for something familiar. The woman had Dad's jaw, that same stubborn set to it. The man had his forehead, broad and lined. Tessa came up behind me and looked at the picture without saying anything for a long time. We had family out there, real family, and they wanted to know us. Tessa was the one who called them first. She always had more courage than me, more willingness to take risks, and I think the grief made her hungry for connection in a way I did not fully understand at the time. Lorraine answered on the second ring and immediately started crying, this soft, broken sound that made my sister tear up too. They talked for almost an hour that first night, while I sat on the couch pretending to sort through old bills, listening to Tessa describe our childhood, our father, the life we had lived without knowing they existed. Lorraine sounded warm and gentle, asking questions about our jobs, our health, our dreams for the future. She kept saying how much we sounded like our father, how happy she was to finally hear our voices. By the time Tessa hung up, she was convinced these were good people who had been wronged by a son who refused to forgive whatever happened between them. I wanted to believe it too. We were orphans now, both parents gone, and the idea of grandparents felt like a life raft in the middle of a dark ocean. Over the following weeks, the phone calls became a regular occurrence, sometimes with Lorraine, sometimes with Donald, occasionally with both of them on speakerphone. They asked about everything, our favorite foods, our allergies, whether we had any health problems growing up. Lorraine mentioned that heart disease ran in the family and urged us to get checkups, said she worried about us now that our father was gone. Donald talked about his own health struggles, a kidney condition that required dialysis 3 times a week, and how grateful he was for modern medicine. They offered to help with our father's remaining debts, sent a check for $5,000 that arrived in a padded envelope with another handwritten note. We deposited it feeling guilty and relieved at the same time. When they invited us to visit them in Arizona for a week, all expenses paid, Tessa accepted before I could even think of a reason to hesitate. Part of me felt uneasy, a small voice asking why Dad had cut these people off so completely, but I pushed it down. I told myself he was just a difficult man who held grudges. I told myself we deserved this chance at having a family again. We flew into Phoenix on a Friday afternoon in late April, and Donald picked us up at the airport in a silver Mercedes that still had that new car smell. He was thinner than he looked in the photograph, his skin carrying a grayish tint that I now recognize as the pallor of someone whose kidneys are failing. But his handshake was firm and his smile seemed genuine, crinkling the corners of his pale blue eyes as he loaded our bags into the trunk. Lorraine was waiting at the house with a spread of food that could have fed 10 people. Homemade lasagna and fresh bread, and a chocolate cake she said was our father's favorite when he was a boy. Their home was even more beautiful than the picture suggested, all terracotta tiles and high ceilings and windows that looked out onto the desert mountains. They had prepared a guest room for each of us, decorated with fresh flowers and soft towels and little baskets of toiletries. Everything felt too perfect, like a movie set designed to make us feel welcome, but I chalked it up to wealth and eagerness. These people had money and they wanted to impress the grandchildren they had never met. The first 2 days were wonderful, or at least they seemed that way on the surface. Lorraine took us shopping and bought Tessa a turquoise necklace that cost more than my monthly rent. Donald showed us his vintage car collection in the garage, 5 gleaming vehicles that he polished himself every Sunday morning. They told us stories about our father as a child, how he loved baseball and hated vegetables, how he used to build model airplanes in his room for hours. I learned that he had a dog named Chester who died when he was 12, and that he cried for a week straight. These details made me ache for the man I had lost, and also made me angry at him for keeping this from us. On the second night, Donald mentioned casually that he had scheduled us appointments at his personal physician's office for Monday morning. Just routine checkups, he said, since we were in town and it was important to know our family medical history. He would cover the cost, of course. Lorraine nodded and added that the doctor could run some blood work, check our kidney function and liver health, make sure we were in good shape. Tessa thanked them without hesitation. I said nothing, but something cold settled into my chest that I could not name. Monday morning came, and Donald drove us to a medical complex on the east side of Scottsdale, a sleek building with tinted windows and a lobby that looked more like a luxury hotel than a clinic. The physician, a tall man named Dr. Ashford with a silver goatee and an expensive watch, greeted Donald like an old friend. They shook hands and exchanged small talk about golf, while Tessa and I sat in the waiting room filling out paperwork. The forms asked detailed questions about our medical history, surgeries, medications, family illnesses going back 3 generations. There was an entire section about organ donation preferences and whether we had ever been tested for tissue compatibility. I stared at those words for a long time, my pen hovering above the page. When I asked the receptionist why they needed this information for a routine checkup, she smiled and said it was standard procedure, nothing to worry about. Dr. Ashford called us back one at a time. He examined me thoroughly, more thoroughly than any doctor ever had, checking my blood pressure, listening to my heart, pressing on my abdomen with cold fingers. He drew 6 vials of blood and asked me to provide a urine sample. Before I left, he mentioned that he wanted to schedule an ultrasound of my kidneys for later in the week, just to establish a baseline for future reference. I found Tessa in the waiting room looking pale and quiet, her arm wrapped in a bandage from her own blood draw. She said Dr. Ashford had asked her strange questions, things like whether she smoked or drank heavily, whether she had ever had hepatitis, whether she would consider being a living donor someday if a family member needed help. She laughed when she told me, said he was probably just being thorough, but her laugh sounded hollow. On the drive back to the house, Donald talked about how important family was, how blood relatives had a responsibility to take care of each other, how his own brother had saved his life years ago by donating bone marrow when Donald had leukemia. Lorraine sat in the passenger seat nodding along, occasionally glancing back at us with an expression I could not read. That night I lay awake in my guest room, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me, replaying every conversation we had since that first letter arrived. The questions about our health, the insistence on checkups, Donald's kidney disease, the forms asking about tissue compatibility. A picture was forming in my mind, ugly and impossible, and I wanted desperately to be wrong. The next morning I woke up early before anyone else in the house was stirring, and I did something I am not proud of. I went into Donald's study, a wood-paneled room at the end of the hallway that he had shown us briefly on our first day, and I searched through his desk. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and every creak of the floorboards made me flinch. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of financial documents and old photographs, I found a folder labeled with our names. Inside were printed copies of our social media profiles, screenshots of posts going back years, a timeline of our lives pieced together from public information. There were notes in Lorraine's handwriting about our jobs, our addresses, our relationship statuses. And there was a letter from a transplant center in Phoenix, dated 2 months before our father died, informing Donald that he had been moved up the kidney transplant waiting list, but that a living donor would significantly improve his chances and reduce wait time. A highlighted section noted that first-degree relatives, particularly younger, healthy adults, were ideal candidates. My hands went numb. I could not feel my fingers as I placed everything back exactly where I found it. I spent the rest of that day pretending nothing had changed, smiling at breakfast, nodding along to Lorraine's stories about her garden club, watching Donald with new eyes as he moved slowly through the house. Every kind gesture now looked like manipulation. Every warm word sounded like a transaction. That afternoon, Lorraine suggested we all look through old family photo albums together, and I sat on the couch between her and Tessa while she turned page after page of faded pictures. There was our father as a baby, as a toddler, as a gap-toothed child squinting into the sun, and then around age 15 the photos stopped. Lorraine's voice got tight when she reached those empty pages. She said our father changed when he was a teenager, became distant and angry, and one day he simply left and never came back. I asked her why, what happened, and she exchanged a glance with Donald that lasted half a second too long. She said she never understood it, that some children just reject their parents for no reason. But I saw something flicker behind her eyes, a shadow of something she was not telling us. That night, while Tessa was in the shower, I pulled her into my room and told her everything I had found. She stared at me like I had lost my mind. Then slowly, horribly, her face crumpled as she realized I was telling the truth. We left the next morning. I told Lorraine that Tessa had gotten a call from work, some emergency at the nursing home that required her to come back early, and we needed to catch the first flight out. Lorraine's face did something complicated when I said it. A flash of panic quickly smoothed into concern. She insisted on driving us to the airport herself, said Donald was not feeling well enough for the trip. The ride was excruciating. 40 minutes of small talk and strained silences while my sister gripped my hand so tight I thought she might break my fingers. At the terminal, Lorraine hugged us both and told us she loved us, that she hoped we would come back soon. That family was the most important thing in the world. Her perfume smelled like lavender, the same scent from that first letter, and it made my stomach turn. As we walked through the sliding doors into the airport, I glanced back and saw her standing by the car, watching us with an expression that haunts me still. It was not sadness or disappointment. It was calculation, the look of someone already planning their next move. We did not speak until we were past security, and then Tessa started crying and could not stop for the entire flight home. We never went back to Arizona. We never answered another phone call from that Scottsdale number. Lorraine sent letters for months afterward, each one more desperate than the last, talking about how much they missed us, how Donald's health was declining, how they just wanted to help and be part of our lives. One letter mentioned that Dr. Ashford had called with our test results and wanted to discuss them with us urgently. Another included a check for $10,000 and a note saying it was an early inheritance, no strings attached. We tore up the checks and burned the letters in the backyard of our father's old apartment, watching the paper curl and blacken in a metal trash can. Tessa and I talk about it sometimes, late at night when neither of us can sleep, trying to understand what kind of people would hunt down their estranged grandchildren to harvest their organs. We think about our father, 15 years old, somehow discovering what his parents were capable of and running as far as he could. We understand now why he never talked about his past, why he raised us like a man with no history. He was protecting us the only way he knew how. I still wonder if Donald ever got his kidney, if some other desperate relative or stranger saved his life. I wonder if Lorraine is still out there, searching obituaries for other family members, other potential donors. Some nights I dream about that house in the desert, those terracotta tiles and high ceilings, and I wake up feeling like I escaped something I will never fully understand. My father saved us twice, once by running away and once by dying before they could reach us through him. I wish I could thank him for that. I wish I could tell him I finally understand. Nobody in my family wanted to deal with Grandpa Warren's house after the funeral, so the job fell on me. I was 34, recently divorced, sleeping on my buddy's couch in Harrisburg, and technically unemployed, which apparently made me the perfect candidate. The old man had lived alone in that place in rural Pennsylvania for over 40 years, collecting everything he ever touched, and the house needed to be cleared before the estate sale in April. I drove out there on a Friday morning in March 2023, expecting maybe 2 weeks of work. The house smelled exactly like I remembered from childhood visits, that mix of old wood, mothballs, and something faintly metallic that I always associated with the basement. Same floral wallpaper in the kitchen, same grandfather clock in the hallway that had been stuck at 3:47 for as long as I could remember. Started upstairs with the easy stuff, clothes and books and old photo albums, but I knew the basement was going to be the real nightmare. Everyone in the family knew about that basement. Grandpa had been shoving things down there since the early 80s. I spent the first 2 days just creating walkways through the mess, broken furniture, dead appliances, towers of magazines and newspapers that reached the ceiling in some spots. My aunt had warned me it would be bad, but she had no idea. By Wednesday afternoon, I finally made it to the far end of the basement, past the ancient furnace that groaned every time the heat kicked on. That is when I noticed something strange. A section of the back wall, maybe 6 feet wide, was completely blocked off by a heavy canvas tarp and a stack of wooden crates. When I dragged the crates aside, there was a door behind them. Not a regular interior door, but a thick metal one, like something you would see on a storage unit, with a heavy padlock holding it shut. The lock was old but solid, no rust on it at all, which meant someone had been maintaining it. I went upstairs and searched through Grandpa's desk for almost an hour before I found a small brass key in an envelope. The envelope just said, "Storage," in his careful handwriting. I remember my palms were damp when I fitted the key into that lock. I figured it was probably valuables, maybe some antiques or cash he did not trust the banks with. I had no idea what I was about to walk into. The door swung open easier than I expected, and the smell hit me first. Not rot or mold, but something clinical, like rubbing alcohol mixed with old paper. I used my phone flashlight to find a pull chain, and when the bare bulb flickered on, I saw a room about the size of a single car garage. The walls were lined with metal shelving units, the industrial kind you see in warehouses, and every shelf was packed with boxes. Cardboard file boxes, the type you buy at office supply stores, each one with a white label on the front. The labels had dates on them. That was the first thing I noticed. Dates going back decades. 1987, 1991, 1994, 2003, 2011. They were not in order, just scattered across the shelves, but there had to be at least 30 or 40 boxes in there. In the center of the room was a wooden desk with an old lamp on it, the kind with the green glass shade, and a chair that looked like it had been sat in thousands of times. The seat cushion was worn down to almost nothing. I stood in that doorway for a long time, just trying to understand what I was looking at. My first thought was that Grandpa had been running some kind of side business, maybe tax stuff, or legal documents for people in town. That would have made sense. That would have been fine. I pulled down the first box I could reach, the one labeled 1994, and set it on the desk. Inside were file folders, maybe a dozen of them, each one thick with papers. I opened the first folder and found newspaper clippings. They were yellow and brittle, carefully cut out and preserved in plastic sleeves. The headlines made my throat tighten. Woman found dead near creek, no suspects. Police baffled by brutal slaying in Westmoreland County. Body discovered in wooded area. Investigation ongoing. Every clipping was about a murder. Unsolved murders. I flipped through the folder, and there had to be 15 or 20 articles in there. All from different newspapers, all from 1994, all about killings that were never solved. At the bottom of the folder, underneath all the clippings, there was a small Ziploc bag. Inside the bag was a silver bracelet with a charm on it, a little heart with the letter M engraved on it. I just stared at it. My brain was trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe Grandpa had been interested in true crime, like those people who follow cold cases as a hobby. Maybe he collected this stuff because he wanted to help somehow. But that bracelet, that was not a newspaper clipping, that was something real, something someone had worn on their wrist. I opened another folder from the same box, more clippings, more unsolved cases, and another Ziploc bag at the bottom. This one had a keychain in it, one of those cheap plastic ones with a photo holder. The photo inside showed a young woman with dark hair smiling at the camera. She looked like she was at a party or a barbecue, holding a red cup. I set it down and opened the next folder. A man's watch, silver band, stopped at 2:17. The next folder had a single earring, gold with a small green stone. Every single folder had something like this at the bottom. Personal items, things that belonged to people. I could feel my heart pounding so hard it was making my vision pulse. I pulled down another box, this one from 2003, and it was the same thing. Clippings about murders in different counties across Pennsylvania, sometimes from Ohio or West Virginia, and always those little bags with items inside. A wedding ring, a hair clip, a set of keys. I counted 8 boxes before I had to stop and sit down in that old chair. The seat was so worn that I could feel the wooden frame underneath. I sat there trying to breathe, trying to think of any explanation that did not lead where my mind was going. That is when I noticed the drawer in the desk. It was locked, but the same brass key from the envelope upstairs fit it. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them, all Polaroids. The old kind with the white border. The first one I picked up showed a crime scene. Yellow police tape, officers standing around, a shape on the ground covered by a white sheet. The photo had been taken from a distance from behind a tree line, like someone was watching from the woods. I flipped to the next one. Another crime scene, different location, same angle. Someone standing at the edge, observing, photographing. There were at least 50 Polaroids in that drawer, and every single one was a crime scene photo taken from outside the official perimeter. Some of them showed the bodies before they were covered. I recognized one of the locations from a newspaper clipping I had just looked at, a wooded area near a creek in Westmoreland County. The article said the body was found by a hiker on a Sunday morning in September 1994. The Polaroid showed the same spot, the same body, but from an angle the police photos never would have captured. Whoever took these pictures had been there. They had been watching. I do not know how long I sat in that room. An hour, maybe more. My phone had died at some point and I had not even noticed. I went upstairs to charge it and splash water on my face, and that is when I saw the calendar on the kitchen wall. Grandpa had kept the same kind of calendar for as long as I could remember. Those big ones with a square for each day where you write appointments. He had a whole stack of old ones in a kitchen drawer, going back years. I do not know what made me start looking through them. Maybe I already knew. Maybe I just needed to see it for myself. I pulled out the 1994 calendar and flipped to September. On the weekend before that woman was found near the creek, there was a note in Grandpa's handwriting. Fishing trip, back Monday. I grabbed the newspaper clipping from downstairs and checked the date. She was found on Sunday, September 18th. According to his calendar, Grandpa was on a fishing trip that whole weekend, left on Friday and came back Monday. I felt sick. I grabbed another calendar, 2003, and cross-referenced it with the clippings from that box. Every single time, every murder, there was a note about Grandpa being out of town, fishing trip, visit cousin in Erie, hardware convention in Pittsburgh, church retreat. I spent the next 3 hours going through every calendar I could find and matching them to the dates in those boxes. 17 years of calendars, and the pattern never broke. Not once. When there was a murder in the clippings, Grandpa was always gone that weekend. Always had some excuse written down in his neat handwriting. I started making a list on a piece of paper, 2 columns, one for the murder date and one for his alibi. By the time I got to the bottom of the page, I had 23 entries, 23 unsolved murders across 3 states, 23 weekends where my grandfather was supposedly fishing or visiting family or attending some event. I thought about calling the police right then. I had my phone in my hand, thumb hovering over the keypad, but I did not. I could not. This was the man who taught me how to ride a bike, the man who took me to baseball games and bought me ice cream and sat with me when I had nightmares. I needed more. I needed to be absolutely sure before I destroyed his memory, before I told my mother that her father was a monster. So I kept digging. At the bottom of the desk drawer, underneath all the Polaroids, there was a leather notebook. The cover was cracked and worn, like it had been handled 1,000 times. I opened it and found page after page of handwritten notes, all in Grandpa's careful script, dates, locations, names. Some entries were just a few lines. April 14th, 1991. Route 30, rest stop near Greensburg. Female, late 20s, brown hair, blue Toyota in the parking lot, alone. Other entries were longer, more detailed. Physical descriptions, habits, what time someone left work or went jogging or walked their dog. I realized I was looking at surveillance notes. He had been watching these people, studying them, learning their routines. The notebook went on for over 100 pages, and not every entry had a corresponding newspaper clipping. Some of them were just notes, just observations, people he had watched but never acted on, or maybe people whose bodies were never found. I thought I was going to throw up. I actually leaned over the desk expecting it to happen, but nothing came up. My body just shook. I had to put my head between my knees and focus on breathing until the room stopped spinning. When I finally looked up again, I noticed something I had missed before. On the wall behind the desk, partially hidden by one of the shelving units, there was a map. It was a large map of Pennsylvania and the surrounding states, pinned to the wall with thumbtacks. And there were marks on it. Red dots, dozens of them scattered across the region. Some had small dates written next to them in black ink. I recognized some of the locations from the newspaper clippings. Westmoreland County, a spot near the Ohio border, somewhere in the mountains up north. Every red dot was a place where someone had died. I stood there staring at that map for a long time, counting the dots. There were more dots than there were boxes on the shelves. A lot more. Some of the older dots, the ones from the 80s, had faded so much they were almost pink. He had been doing this for decades, maybe since before I was born, maybe since before my mother was born. I thought about every family dinner, every Christmas, every Thanksgiving where Grandpa sat at the head of the table and carved the turkey and told jokes that made everyone laugh. I thought about the way he used to call me champ and ruffle my hair, how he smelled like pipe tobacco and peppermint. This man, this monster, had been hiding in plain sight my entire life, and nobody had ever suspected a thing. I left that room and locked it behind me. I sat on the basement stairs for what felt like hours, just staring at the concrete floor, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to burn it all, drag those boxes outside, douse them in gasoline, and watch decades of horror turn to ash. Nobody would ever know. Grandpa would stay the kind old man in everyone's memory, and I would carry this secret until I died. But then I thought about those items in the Ziploc bags. The bracelet with the letter M, the keychain with the smiling woman, the wedding ring. Those belonged to real people. People who had families that never got answers, never got closure, spent years wondering what happened to their daughter or sister or wife. I could not take that from them. I could not let Grandpa win one more time. So I called the police. I sat on those basement stairs and dialed 911 and told the dispatcher that I had found something at my grandfather's house, something related to old crimes, and I needed someone to come look at it. The deputy who showed up probably thought I was crazy at first. Some guy rambling about boxes and murder clippings in a secret room. But then I showed him. I watched his face change as he opened those folders and saw the Polaroids and the map. He made some calls, and within 2 hours that house was full of state police and FBI agents. That was almost 2 years ago now. I am still not allowed to talk about the details of the investigation, but I can tell you what became public record. They matched items from those boxes to 14 unsolved murders across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. 14 families who finally learned what happened to their loved ones. The investigators told me there are probably more, cases from the 70s and early 80s where the evidence is too degraded to make a definitive connection. My mother stopped speaking to me after the story hit the news. She says I destroyed her father's memory for nothing, that I must have misunderstood what I found, that there has to be another explanation. There is not. I know what I saw in that room. I know what those calendars said. Some nights I still dream about that map on the wall, all those faded red dots spreading across 3 states like a disease. I think about the fact that he died peacefully in his sleep at 87 years old, surrounded by family, and never answered for any of it. I think about how I sat on his lap as a kid and he read me stories before bed. And I wonder how many other families out there have basements they have never looked in, with doors they have never opened, hiding secrets that would shatter everything they thought they knew. Hospital rooms have a particular silence that sits heavy in the air, different from any other kind of quiet I have ever experienced. I learned that during my years as a nurse at St. Catherine Memorial in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. but nothing prepared me for how that silence would feel when it was my own grandmother lying in the bed. October 2017 was supposed to be a good month for me. I had just gotten engaged to my college sweetheart, we were planning a spring wedding, and life seemed to be falling into place the way everyone always promised it would. Then my mother called at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, her voice cracking, as she told me that Nana Ruth had collapsed in her kitchen, and the doctors were saying she might not have much time left. I drove 3 hours through rain so heavy I could barely see the road, my knuckles white against the steering wheel, praying to a God I was not sure I believed in anymore. By the time I arrived, she had already slipped into that halfway state between consciousness and whatever comes next, her eyes closed and her breathing shallow and labored. Nana Ruth was 87 years old, and until that Tuesday morning, she had seemed invincible to me. She still lived alone in the same farmhouse where she had raised my mother, still tended her vegetable garden every spring, still made her famous apple butter every fall, and sent jars of it to everyone in the family. I had graduated nursing school when I was 23, young and idealistic, convinced that understanding the mechanics of death would somehow make it easier to face. Sitting beside her bed that Wednesday, holding her hand while my parents took turns pacing the hallway and making phone calls, I realized how wrong I had been. Her skin felt like tissue paper, thin and dry and fragile in a way that made my throat tighten every time I looked at her. She had been mumbling in her sleep all morning, fragments of sentences that made no sense, names I did not recognize, what sounded like apologies directed at people who were not in the room. I thought it was just the medication, or the confusion that often comes at the end, until her fingers suddenly curled around mine with surprising strength and her eyes snapped open. She looked directly at me, and for a moment she was completely lucid, completely present, and completely terrified. She was not supposed to come home that night, Nana Ruth whispered, her voice dry and cracked like autumn leaves. I leaned closer, thinking I had misheard her, thinking maybe she was still caught in some dream from her past, but her eyes were locked onto mine with an intensity that made me want to pull away. I need to tell you, before I go, I need someone to know. Her grip on my hand tightened even more, her brittle fingernails pressing into my palm hard enough to leave marks. I glanced toward the door, wondering if I should call for my mother, but something in Nana Ruth's expression stopped me. She looked like a woman who had been carrying a weight for so long that her bones had bent around it. And now, at the very end, she was desperate to set it down. I told her it was okay, that she could tell me anything, that I was listening. I had no idea what I was agreeing to hear. She started talking in a voice so low I had to lean my ear close to her mouth, close enough to smell the staleness of her breath and the faint chemical scent of the medications dripping into her arm. She told me about a night in the summer of 1987, a night when she was still living in Waynesboro with my grandfather before he passed. She told me about her neighbor, a woman named Donna Whitmore, who lived in a small blue house at the end of Chestnut Road with her husband and 2 young children. Nana Ruth's voice trembled as she described Donna, a quiet woman with auburn hair, who always wore a silver cross around her neck and who brought over casseroles whenever someone in the neighborhood was sick. She was kind, Nana Ruth said, and something in the way she said it made my chest feel tight. She did not deserve what happened to her, none of it, and I let them blame the wrong person because I was too afraid to speak. I sat there frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs, watching tears leak from the corners of my grandmother's eyes and disappear into the pillow beneath her head. The story came out in fragments, like she was pulling pieces of glass from a wound that had never properly healed. That summer night in 1987, Donna Whitmore was supposed to be visiting her sister in Pittsburgh. Her husband, a man named Gene, had told everyone in the neighborhood that Donna would be gone for the whole weekend. He mentioned it at the hardware store, at the diner, to anyone who would listen. Nana Ruth said she remembered thinking it was strange how often he brought it up, like he wanted to make sure people knew the house would be empty, except for him and the kids. She was sitting on her porch that Friday evening, shelling peas into a metal bowl, when she saw someone walking up the path toward the Whitmore house. It was not Gene. It was a man she recognized from church, someone named Lloyd Becker, who worked at the lumber mill on the edge of town and who had been seen talking to Jean in hushed voices for weeks before that night. Lloyd was carrying something wrapped in a dark cloth, something long and heavy, and he walked with the kind of purpose that made Nana Ruth set down her bowl of peas and watch. She told me she almost called out to him, almost asked what he was doing there when Jean's wife was supposed to be away. But something stopped her, a feeling in her gut, a warning she could not name, a sense that she was seeing something she was not supposed to see. She watched Lloyd disappear around the back of the Whitmore house, and she told herself it was none of her business, that he was probably just there to help Jean with some project, that there was nothing wrong with a man visiting his friend on a Friday night. She went inside and made dinner for my grandfather, and she tried to forget about the way Lloyd had walked, the way his shoulders were hunched like he was bracing for something. It was almost midnight when she heard the screaming. Even 30 years later, lying in that hospital bed, Nana Ruth's face twisted when she described the sound. Raw, animalistic, the kind of scream that does not sound human because humans are not supposed to feel that much pain. The screaming stopped after a few minutes, and then there were sirens, and then the flashing lights of police cars lit up the whole street in red and blue. Donna Whitmore had come home early from Pittsburgh because her sister had gotten sick. She was not supposed to be there, but she was. The police ruled it a burglary gone wrong. Donna had walked in on an intruder, they said, someone who panicked and attacked her before fleeing into the night. Jean played the grieving husband so well that no one thought to look at him too closely. He wept at the funeral. He held his children. He accepted casseroles from the same neighbors who had received them from his dead wife. But there was a man who lived 2 streets over, a drifter named Terrence Gould, who had been in town for only a few months, doing odd jobs and sleeping in a room above the old feed store. Terrence had a record: petty theft, a bar fight that landed him 6 months in county jail, and he had no alibi for that Friday night because he had been drinking alone in his room. The police found a pawn ticket in his pocket for a silver necklace with a cross pendant, and that was enough. Terrence Gould was arrested, tried, and convicted of Donna Whitmore's murder within 8 months. He died in prison in 2003, still swearing he was innocent, still claiming he had bought that necklace from a man he met outside a bar and had no idea where it really came from. Nana Ruth's voice broke when she told me why she never said anything. Lloyd Becker was her brother. Her younger brother, the baby of the family, the one she had helped raise after their mother died when Lloyd was only 6 years old. She had watched him take his first steps, taught him to read, protected him from their father's temper when the old man came home drunk and looking for someone to hit. Lloyd was not a good man. She knew that, she had always known that. But he was her blood, and when the police came knocking on doors asking if anyone had seen anything unusual that night, she told them no. She said she had been inside all evening, that she had not looked out her window, that she had not seen Lloyd walking toward the Whitmore house with something heavy in his hands. She lied to protect the boy she had raised, and in doing so, she condemned an innocent man to die behind bars for a crime he did not commit. "I have carried it every day since," she whispered, her voice barely audible now, her grip on my hand weakening. "Every single day, and now I am going to meet my Maker, and I do not know if he will forgive me. But I needed you to know. Someone had to know the truth." She died less than an hour later, slipping away so quietly that I almost missed it. One moment she was breathing, shallow and labored, and the next moment, she simply was not. I sat there holding her hand long after it went cold, unable to move, unable to process what she had told me. My mother came back into the room with 2 cups of coffee and found me like that, staring at Nana Ruth's face, tears streaming down my cheeks without me even realizing I was crying. I did not tell her what I had heard. I did not tell anyone. Part of me wanted to believe it was just the ramblings of a dying woman, the confusion of a brain shutting down, memories tangled with dreams and regrets that had no basis in reality. I held on to that hope through the funeral, through the burial in the little cemetery behind the Methodist church, where Nana Ruth had worshipped for 60 years, through the weeks that followed when I tried to return to my normal life and pretend that everything was fine. But I could not stop thinking about Donna Whitmore, about Terrence Gould, about a man named Lloyd Becker who walked toward a house with something heavy in his hands on a summer night 30 years ago. It was almost 3 weeks after the funeral when I finally broke down and searched for it online. I told myself I just wanted to prove that Nana Ruth had been confused, that there was no murder on Chestnut Road in Waynesboro in 1987, that the whole story was a fiction her dying brain had constructed from fragments of old television shows and half-remembered news reports. I typed in Donna Whitmore Waynesboro 1987 and hit enter, and the first result made me feel like all the air had been sucked out of the room. There she was, a newspaper photograph from the Waynesboro Herald, grainy and faded, but unmistakably real. Auburn hair, a gentle smile, a small silver cross visible at her throat. The headline read, "Local Woman Slain in Home Invasion," and the date was July 18, 1987. I scrolled through article after article, my hands trembling against the keyboard, reading about the investigation, the arrest, the trial, the conviction. Terrence Gould's mugshot stared back at me from the screen, a thin man with hollow eyes and a look of bewildered terror, like he could not understand what was happening to him. And then I found something that made me stop breathing entirely. A small article from just 2 months earlier, buried in the local news section of the Waynesboro paper. The headline read, "Cold Case Review, 1987. Whitmore Murder Reopened After New Evidence Surfaces." I read that article so many times that I could recite it from memory. A detective named Hank Ellsworth had been assigned to review old cases as part of a state initiative, and when he pulled the Whitmore file, he found inconsistencies that the original investigators had overlooked. The pawn ticket that convicted Terrence Gould had been dated July 19th, 1 day after the murder. But the pawnshop owner's records showed he had not opened until noon that day, and witnesses placed Terrence passed out drunk in his room above the feed store until well past 2 in the afternoon. There was no way he could have pawned that necklace in the window of time the prosecution claimed. More troubling still, Detective Ellsworth had found notes in the original case file suggesting that another neighbor had mentioned seeing someone near the Whitmore house that night, a man who did not match Terrence Gould's description at all. That lead was never followed up. The neighbor who made the statement had died in 1994, but her name was still there in the file, written in faded blue ink on a yellowed piece of paper. Her name was Ruth Becker, my grandmother. She had told the police something after all, something that contradicted her later testimony, and someone had buried it. I spent the next week barely sleeping, barely eating, reading everything I could find about the case and about the people involved. Gene Whitmore had remarried in 1991 and moved to Florida, where he died of a heart attack in 2008. Lloyd Becker, my great-uncle, a man I had never met, whose name I had never even heard until Nana Ruth whispered it in that hospital room, had left Waynesboro shortly after the trial and spent the rest of his life drifting between small towns in the Midwest. He died alone in a motel room in Iowa in 2012. Liver failure, no family at the funeral. The only people still alive who might know the truth were Donna's 2 children, now grown adults with families of their own, and they had apparently been the ones pushing for the case to be reopened. I found an interview with the daughter, a woman named Catherine who was 6 years old when her mother was killed. She said she had spent her whole life believing Terrence Gould was the monster who destroyed her family, but now she was not so sure. She said she remembered things from that night, fragments that did not make sense, images of her father talking to a man in their backyard while her mother was supposed to be in Pittsburgh. She was too young to understand what she was seeing, but the memory never left her. I called Detective Ellsworth on a Monday morning in November, sitting in my car in the parking lot of the hospital where I worked because I could not bring myself to make that call from inside my apartment. My voice was shaking when I told him who I was and what I knew, and there was a long silence on the other end of the line before he asked me to come to the station and give a formal statement. I drove to Waynesboro that same afternoon, 3 hours through the same route I had taken to see my grandmother die, and I sat in a small gray room with fluorescent lights and told a stranger everything Nana Ruth had told me. I showed him the notes I had written in the days after her death, every detail I could remember, every name and every description. He listened without interrupting, his face completely unreadable. and when I finished, he thanked me and said they would be in touch. I walked out of that station feeling hollowed out, like I had left something essential behind in that room. I had just destroyed my grandmother's memory, exposed her as someone who let an innocent man rot in prison to protect a killer. But I also knew that Terrence Gould deserved to have his name cleared, even if he was no longer alive to see it. His family deserved to know. Donna's children deserved to know. The truth does not stop mattering just because the people who lived it are gone. The case is still under investigation as of now. Detective Ellsworth told me last month that they are working on officially exonerating Terrence Gould, though these things take time, and the wheels of justice turn slowly, especially for a man who has been dead for over 15 years. I never told my mother what Nana Ruth confessed to me, and I do not know if I ever will. Some truths are too heavy to share with people who love the person being accused, and my mother worshipped her mother the way I once did. I think about Nana Ruth every day now, not the woman who made apple butter and taught me to bake pies, but the woman who sat on her porch and watched a man walk toward a murder and did nothing to stop it. I think about how she lived with that secret for 30 years, how she went to church every Sunday and prayed to a God she believed was watching, how she held that weight until it finally crushed her. I do not know if I can forgive her. I do not know if anyone can. But I know that she wanted the truth to come out, even if she was too afraid to be the one who told it. In the end, that was why she told me. She knew I would not be able to stay silent. She knew I would do what she never could. And maybe that was her way of making amends, passing the burden to someone strong enough to carry it into the light. I just wish she had done it 30 years sooner, before Terrence Gould died alone in a prison cell for a crime he did not commit, still waiting for someone to believe him. Grandma Evelyn called me on a Wednesday night, said she needed help going through some old boxes in the attic, and asked if I could come stay for the weekend. She sounded strange on the phone, her voice shaky in a way I had never heard before, and Grandpa Howard kept interrupting in the background saying something I could not make out. They lived on this 40-acre property in rural West Virginia, mostly forest and overgrown farmland, a place that had been in the family since before my mom was born. I had not visited since Thanksgiving 2 years prior, and guilt had been eating at me. So I told her yes, took Friday off work and made the 6-hour drive from Richmond. My friends thought it was sweet that I was helping my elderly grandparents. They had no idea what I was actually walking into. None of us did. If I had known, I would have stayed home and never answered that phone call. I would have let it ring until the voicemail picked up and then deleted it without listening. I pulled up to their property around 4 in the afternoon that Friday, the first week of April, when everything was still brown and dead from winter. The driveway was nearly a quarter mile of gravel that had mostly turned to mud, and my car struggled through the deeper spots. Grandma was waiting on the porch when I got there, wrapped in a thick cardigan even though it was not that cold, and she looked smaller than I remembered. Grandpa stayed inside watching some game show on the old television, barely acknowledged me when I walked through the door with my overnight bag. There was this tension in the house that I picked up on immediately, little looks between them when they thought I was not paying attention. Grandma would start to say something and then catch herself, change the subject to something mundane like the weather or what she was making for dinner. I figured they were just getting old, maybe having some health issues they did not want to worry me about. But it was more than that. Something was wrong in that house, something neither of them wanted to talk about, and I spent that whole first evening trying to figure out what it was. Saturday morning I woke up early, around 6, because I heard the back door slam shut. I looked out the window of the guest bedroom and saw Grandpa walking toward the tree line at the edge of their property, carrying a plastic grocery bag in one hand. He moved faster than I had seen him move in years, with purpose, like he had somewhere to be. I thought maybe he was going to feed some stray cats or check on something in the old barn, so I did not think much of it and went back to bed for another hour. When I came downstairs for breakfast, he was already back, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee like nothing had happened. Grandma made scrambled eggs and toast, and we talked about normal things, my job, my apartment, whether I was seeing anyone. But I noticed the grocery bag was gone, and when I casually asked Grandpa what he had been doing outside so early, he just said he was checking the property line for fallen branches. Grandma's fork stopped halfway to her mouth for just a second, then she kept eating like everything was fine. That was the first real lie I caught them in, and it made me curious about what else they were hiding. After breakfast, Grandma asked if I wanted to take a walk around the property, get some fresh air before we started on the attic boxes. I said sure, thinking it might be nice to stretch my legs after the long drive. We walked past the old chicken coop that had not housed chickens in decades, past the collapsing barn with the rusted tractor inside, and toward the edge of the woods. Grandma pointed out different trees she remembered from her childhood, told me stories about playing in these woods when she was a girl. But I noticed she kept steering us away from a certain direction, always finding a reason to turn left instead of right, to circle back toward the house. At one point I saw what looked like a worn path cutting through the underbrush, heading deeper into the forest, and I asked her where it led. She got quiet for a moment, then said it was just an old hunting trail that did not go anywhere anymore. Her voice was tight when she said it, and she would not meet my eyes. That path was clearly still being used, the vegetation trampled down, fresh boot prints visible in the mud. Someone had walked that trail recently, and Grandma did not want me to know about it. That afternoon, while my grandparents were napping, I decided to follow the trail myself. I told myself I was just curious. Maybe there was an old shed or something interesting back there, nothing to worry about. I put on my hiking boots and headed into the woods, following the worn path through the trees. The forest was dense, mostly oak and pine, and the further I walked, the quieter everything got. No birds singing, no squirrels running through the branches, just my footsteps crunching on dead leaves. After about 10 minutes, the trail opened up into a small clearing, and that is when I saw the well. It was an old stone well, the kind you see in pictures from 100 years ago, with a wooden cover that had been placed over the top. The cover looked newer than the well itself, maybe only a few years old, and there were heavy rocks placed on top of it like someone wanted to make sure it stayed closed. But what really got my attention was the structure next to it, half hidden by overgrown bushes. It looked like an old root cellar or storm shelter, a concrete entrance built into a small hill with a rusted metal door that was slightly ajar. I should have turned around right there. Every instinct told me to go back to the house and pretend I never found this place. But I kept thinking about Grandpa sneaking out at dawn with that grocery bag, about Grandma steering me away from this direction, about all the strange looks and half-finished sentences. So I walked over to the shelter and pulled the door open wider. The hinges screamed with rust and a smell hit me immediately, damp earth and something else, something stale and human. I used my phone flashlight to look inside and my heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. There were stairs leading down into darkness, maybe 8 or 10 concrete steps, and at the bottom I could see a small room. Someone had been living down there. There was a cot with blankets piled on it, empty water bottles scattered on the floor, canned food stacked against the wall, a bucket in the corner that I did not want to think about. And on the walls, written in what looked like marker or maybe charcoal, were words. Sentences. Please. I made myself go down those stairs even though every part of me wanted to run. And I started reading what was written on those concrete walls. The handwriting was messy, desperate. Some of it scratched so hard into the concrete that whoever wrote it must have broken the marker or charcoal more than once. The first thing I read was near the door, at eye level, and it said, "Please don't send me back, they will kill me." No punctuation, no capitals, just raw fear put into words. Further along the wall, there was more. I did what you asked, I stayed quiet. And then, in bigger letters near the cot, "How long do I have to stay here?" There were tally marks scratched into one section of the wall, grouped in sets of 5, and I counted them twice to make sure. 117 days. Someone had been down here for almost 4 months, marking each day, waiting for something. The most recent writing was near the stairs, and it was different from the rest. calmer somehow, more resigned. It just said, "They are good people, they are trying to help me, I know that now." That one disturbed me more than all the desperate pleas combined. It sounded like something a person would write after they had given up, after they had accepted whatever was happening to them. I took pictures of everything with my phone, my hands trembling so badly that half of them came out blurry. I searched the rest of the shelter, looking for anything that might tell me who had been kept down here. Under the cot, I found a small pile of clothes, a worn flannel shirt and jeans that looked like they belonged to a man, maybe medium build. There was a paperback book with the cover torn off, some kind of thriller from what I could tell, with pages dog-eared throughout. In the corner behind the food cans, I found a wallet. It was old, the leather cracked and faded, and inside there was no money, no credit cards, just a West Virginia driver's license. The photo showed a man in his 30s, thin face, dark hair, tired eyes. The name on the license was Curtis Allen Webb, and according to the birth date, he would have been 34 when the license was issued. The issue date was 2015, which meant it had expired years ago. I stared at that face for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. Who was this man? Why had my grandparents been keeping him in an underground shelter on their property? And where was he now? The cot had not been slept in recently. The blankets were cold, and there was a layer of dust on everything. Whoever Curtis Webb was, he had not been down here for a while, but someone was still maintaining this place, still coming out here. The grocery bag Grandpa had carried that morning had to be connected somehow. I put the wallet in my pocket and climbed back up those stairs, my legs shaking so bad I had to grip the railing to keep from falling. When I got outside, I looked at the well again, really looked at it this time. The wooden cover was thick, solid, built to hold weight. Those rocks on top were not decoration, they were there to keep something in or keep someone out. I walked over and tried to move one of the rocks, but it was heavier than it looked, maybe 40 or 50 pounds. I managed to slide it to the side, then another one until I could lift the edge of the wooden cover just enough to peer inside. The smell that came up was horrible, wet and rotten, like standing water mixed with decay. I shined my phone flashlight down into the darkness, but the well was deep, maybe 30 feet, and I could not see the bottom clearly. There was water down there, black and still, and something floating on the surface. It looked like fabric, maybe cloth, bunched up and waterlogged. I could not tell what it was, and I did not want to know. I dropped the cover back down, shoved the rocks into place, and walked back to the house as fast as I could without running. My grandparents were awake when I got back, sitting in the living room watching television like nothing in the world was wrong. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at these two people I had known my whole life, trying to reconcile the grandparents who had taught me to fish and baked me birthday cakes with whatever was happening in that underground shelter. Grandma looked up and smiled at me, asked if I had enjoyed my walk. I said yes, it was nice, and then I went upstairs to the guest room and locked the door. I sat on the bed and pulled out the wallet, stared at Curtis Webb's face on that expired license. I searched his name on my phone, but the signal out there was terrible, barely one bar and nothing would load. I tried different combinations: Curtis Webb, West Virginia, Curtis Webb missing person, Curtis Webb obituary. The pages just kept spinning, never loading, and eventually I gave up. I needed to confront my grandparents, but I had no idea how to even start that conversation. "Hey Grandma, I found your underground bunker and the ID of the man you were keeping prisoner. Want to explain?" It sounded insane even in my own head, but I could not just pretend I had not seen what I saw. That shelter, those desperate words on the walls, the thing floating in the well. Something terrible had happened on this property, and my grandparents were at the center of it. I waited until dinner, sat across from them at the kitchen table while Grandma served meatloaf and mashed potatoes like it was any normal Saturday night. I could barely eat, just pushed the food around my plate, trying to find the right words. Finally, when Grandpa got up to refill his water glass, I pulled out the wallet and set it on the table. Grandma saw it first, and the color drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint. She grabbed the edge of the table with both hands, steadying herself, and whispered something I could not hear. Grandpa turned around, saw the wallet, and his whole body went rigid. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Grandma looked at me with these eyes I had never seen before, tired and scared and somehow relieved all at once. And she said they had been wondering when someone would find out. She said they had been carrying this for years, that it had been eating them alive, and maybe it was time to finally tell someone the truth. Grandpa sat back down heavily, like his legs could not hold him anymore, and he told me to put the wallet away because he could not stand to look at that face again. They told me Curtis Webb showed up at their door in the fall of 2015, desperate, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, begging them to hide him. He said people were after him, bad people, that he had seen something he should not have seen and now they wanted him dead. My grandparents did not know what to do. They were isolated out here, no close neighbors, and this terrified man was pleading for his life on their porch. So they let him stay in the old storm shelter, just for a few days until things calmed down. That was what they told themselves. But the days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Curtis was paranoid, would not let them call the police, said the people looking for him had connections everywhere. Grandma brought him food and water every day. Grandpa reinforced the shelter door, and they kept his secret. They told me he was a good man, just scared that he never hurt anyone and never asked for much. He wrote on the walls to keep himself sane, counting the days until it was safe to leave. But it was never safe, or at least that is what Curtis believed, and eventually something in him just broke. Grandma stopped talking at this point, could not continue, and Grandpa had to finish the story with tears running down his face. He told me that one morning in early 2016, after Curtis had been in the shelter for about 4 months, Grandma went to bring him breakfast and found the door wide open. Curtis was gone. His clothes were still there, the blankets, everything except the man himself. They searched the property for days, called out his name, checked every building and every corner of those 40 acres. Nothing. He had just vanished in the middle of the night without taking anything with him. Grandpa said they assumed he finally felt safe enough to leave, that he had slipped away to start over somewhere new. But then I asked about the well. The question came out of my mouth before I could stop it, and both of them went silent. Grandma started crying, these quiet sobs that shook her whole body, and Grandpa just stared at the table like he was looking through it into something terrible. He said they found the well cover moved a few weeks after Curtis disappeared, said they looked inside and saw something floating in the water but could not bring themselves to go down there and check. They convinced themselves it was just old clothes, debris, anything but what they feared it might be. They put the cover back, weighed it down with rocks, and never spoke about it again. Not to each other, not to anyone, for almost 10 years. I left the next morning, barely said goodbye, drove those 6 hours back to Richmond with my head spinning. I never called the police. I know I should have, but these were my grandparents, 2 people in their 80s who had already lost their daughter and were clearly tormented by whatever happened to Curtis Webb. What would reporting it accomplish now? If Curtis was in that well, he had been dead for almost a decade. And my grandparents, they genuinely believed they were helping someone, hiding a scared man from people who wanted to hurt him. Were they wrong to do it? Probably. Did something go horribly wrong? Almost certainly. But I could not be the one to send them to prison for the last years of their lives. Grandpa passed away 8 months later, heart attack in his sleep. Grandma followed him 6 weeks after that, like she just gave up once he was gone. I inherited the property, all 40 acres of it, and I have not set foot on it since. The house is still standing, the shelter is still out there in the woods, and that well is still covered with those heavy rocks. I think about Curtis Webb sometimes, wonder who he really was, what he saw that made him so afraid, whether anyone ever came looking for him. I think about what might be floating in that black water, waiting to be found. But I am never going back there to check. Some answers are not worth knowing, and some secrets should stay buried exactly where they are. My grandmother waited until she was 83 years old to finally tell me the truth. I had driven down to Tucson to visit my grandparents, something I try to do every few months now that my grandfather's dementia has gotten worse. 15 years of producing television commercials in Los Angeles had taught me plenty about how this industry destroys people, and my graduating class from film school back in 2007 has mostly scattered to other careers by now. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what she told me that afternoon, sitting in her kitchen while my grandfather slept in the next room. She gripped my wrist with surprising strength and said she needed to tell me something before it was too late. Something about why they left the business in 1974, when both of them were on the verge of real success. I had always wondered why two people with genuine talent, my grandmother a session singer, and my grandfather a sought-after studio musician, had simply vanished from an industry they loved. The family story was always vague. Something about wanting a quieter life, about raising my mother away from the chaos of Los Angeles. But sitting there watching her face in the afternoon light, I could see she was about to unravel 50 years of carefully constructed silence. She started by asking if I remembered the name Clive Ashford. I told her I did not, and she nodded slowly, like she expected that answer. Clive Ashford, she explained, was a talent manager who operated out of a beautiful office on Wilshire Boulevard during the early 70s. He represented legitimate artists, some of them famous names I would recognize, and that legitimacy was exactly what made him so dangerous. My grandmother had been introduced to him through a mutual friend at a recording session in October of 1974. She was 26 years old, married to my grandfather for 3 years, and hungry for the kind of breakthrough that seemed perpetually just out of reach. Clive told her he had connections to a major label that was looking for fresh voices for a new project, something experimental that could launch careers overnight. He was charming, well-dressed, and spoke with the confidence of someone who had opened doors for dozens of artists before. My grandmother said she felt lucky, chosen even, when he invited her to a private audition at a studio in the Valley the following Saturday. My grandfather had a conflicting gig that day, a wedding reception in San Diego, so she would be going alone. That detail, she said, was not a coincidence. She understands that now. Clive had been watching them for weeks, learning their schedules, waiting for the right moment. The address Clive gave her led to an industrial area in Van Nuys, far from the polished studios she was used to. My grandmother told me she almost turned around when she saw the building, a squat concrete structure with no signage, surrounded by a chain-link fence and empty lots filled with dead weeds. But there were other cars in the parking lot, nice ones, a Cadillac and a Lincoln Continental, and she convinced herself that serious music people often worked in unglamorous spaces. She parked her Volkswagen Beetle and walked toward the entrance, where a young man in a suit was waiting with a clipboard. He checked her name, smiled warmly, and led her inside. The interior was surprisingly well appointed, with wood paneling, thick carpet, and framed gold records on the walls. She remembered feeling relieved, thinking she had misjudged the exterior. The young man brought her to a lounge area where 2 other women were already waiting, both around her age, both clearly singers or actresses based on their careful makeup and nervous energy. They exchanged polite introductions, first names only, and waited together on leather couches while soft jazz played from hidden speakers. After about 20 minutes, Clive appeared through a side door, wearing a burgundy blazer and rings on 3 fingers that caught the light when he gestured. He welcomed them effusively, calling each woman by name without checking any notes, complimenting specific details about their previous work that made it clear he had done his research. My grandmother said he had this way of making you feel like the most important person in the room, like he genuinely believed in your talent and wanted nothing more than to see you succeed. He explained that the audition would be a bit unconventional, that the label executives preferred to see how artists handled unexpected situations, how they thought on their feet. He asked them to follow him down a hallway to the main studio space. My grandmother remembers walking behind the other 2 women, noticing how thick the walls seemed, how the jazz music faded completely as they moved deeper into the building. When they reached a heavy metal door at the end of the corridor, Clive produced a key from his pocket and unlocked it with a theatrical flourish. He pushed it open and stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. My grandmother was the last one through, and she heard the lock click shut behind her before she fully registered what she was seeing. The room was not a recording studio. It was a warehouse space, bare concrete floors and exposed pipes overhead, with industrial lighting that buzzed and flickered. In the center stood a long table covered with items that made no sense in context. Jewelry, watches, stacks of documents, a typewriter, several cameras, and what looked like bundles of cash wrapped in rubber bands. 3 men sat on folding chairs against the far wall, none of them dressed like music executives. They wore work clothes, denim and flannel, and they watched the women enter with expressions that my grandmother described as hungry, like they had been waiting a long time for this moment. Clive walked past the women toward the table, still smiling, still projecting that easy confidence. He picked up a manila folder and opened it, reading aloud from what appeared to be a script. He said they had been selected for a special opportunity, a chance to earn more money in one afternoon than most session singers made in a year. All they had to do was follow instructions. One of the other women, a blonde with a southern accent, asked what kind of instructions. Clive set down the folder and explained, in the same pleasant tone he might use to discuss recording schedules, that they would be driving to a location in Beverly Hills and retrieving certain items from a residence while the owners were away. My grandmother said the reality of the situation hit her like a physical blow. This was not an audition. This was a recruitment, and they were being asked to commit burglary. The other 2 women reacted differently than she expected. The blonde went pale and started crying quietly, but the 3rd woman, a brunette who had introduced herself as Francine, seemed almost unsurprised, like she had suspected something was wrong from the beginning but had come anyway. Clive continued talking, explaining that the homeowners were out of the country, that the security system had already been disabled by an inside contact, that the whole job would take less than an hour. He emphasized that no one would get hurt, that the items they were taking were insured, that the victims were wealthy people who would barely notice the loss. He made it sound reasonable, almost victimless. Then he mentioned the compensation. $10,000 each in cash paid immediately upon completion. My grandmother told me that even in her fear, even knowing this was deeply wrong, some part of her brain did the math. $10,000 in 1974 was more than she and my grandfather earned in 6 months combined. She hated herself for even considering it, but that hesitation, those few seconds of temptation, bought her enough time to notice something important about the room they were standing in. There was a second door. It was partially hidden behind a stack of wooden pallets in the corner, painted the same gray as the walls, but she could see the outline of a frame and the glint of a handle. She did not look at it directly, did not want to draw attention, but she mapped its position in her mind while Clive kept talking. He was explaining the logistics now, how they would travel in separate vehicles, how they would enter through a service entrance at the back of the property, how each woman would be responsible for specific items on a list. One of the men against the wall stood up and walked toward them, holding 3 pairs of thin leather gloves. My grandmother accepted hers without making eye contact, feeling the soft material between her fingers, understanding that this was real, that these people had done this before, that they had a system. The blonde woman was openly sobbing now, saying she wanted to go home, that she had a daughter waiting for her. Clive's demeanor shifted for the first time. His smile remained, but something cold entered his voice when he told her that leaving was not an option, that they knew where she lived, where her daughter went to school, that cooperation was the only path forward. The room went silent except for the buzzing lights overhead. My grandmother felt her heart pounding so hard, she worried the men could see it through her blouse. Francine spoke up then, asking practical questions about the timeline, the target address, what kind of vehicle they would be using. My grandmother realized with a sickening clarity that Francine was going to go through with it, that she had already made her decision, perhaps before she even walked into this building. Clive seemed pleased by her cooperation and turned his attention to answering her questions in detail. While he was distracted, my grandmother took a small step backward, then another, positioning herself closer to the hidden door. She was not thinking clearly, operating on pure survival instinct, her body making decisions her conscious mind had not yet approved. The blonde woman suddenly collapsed onto the floor, hyperventilating, and both of the seated men rushed forward to help restrain her. In that moment of chaos, with everyone's attention on the crying woman, my grandmother moved. She crossed the distance to the pallets in 4 quick strides, found the door handle, and pulled. It was unlocked. She slipped through into darkness and ran without looking back, her heels clattering against concrete, her lungs burning, her mind completely blank except for one repeating thought: "Get out, get out, get out." The door led to a narrow corridor that smelled like motor oil and rust. Emergency exit signs glowed red at intervals along the ceiling, and she followed them blindly, stumbling twice on debris she could not see, tearing her stockings on something sharp. She could hear shouting behind her now, male voices echoing off the walls, but she did not slow down. The corridor ended at a metal fire door with a push bar, and she hit it at full speed, bursting out into blinding afternoon sunlight. She found herself in an alley behind the building, dumpsters overflowing with garbage, a stray dog watching her from beside a pile of cardboard boxes. Her Volkswagen was parked on the other side of the building, impossible to reach without being seen, so she made a decision in a fraction of a second and ran the opposite direction, toward the street. She kicked off her heels and sprinted barefoot on hot asphalt, not caring about the pain, not caring about anything except putting distance between herself and that gray concrete room. She reached a busy intersection and flagged down the first car she saw, a station wagon driven by an elderly woman who looked terrified by this barefoot, wild-eyed stranger pounding on her window. My grandmother begged her to drive, said she was being chased, said her life was in danger. The woman hesitated for only a moment before unlocking the door. They drove in silence for several miles before my grandmother felt safe enough to speak. The woman, whose name she never learned, dropped her at a gas station in Burbank, where she called my grandfather from a payphone. She was crying so hard she could barely form words, and he left the wedding reception immediately, driving 90 miles an hour up the freeway to reach her. When he arrived, she told him everything, every detail, sitting in the front seat of his car in that gas station parking lot while the sun went down. My grandfather wanted to go to the police, but my grandmother refused. Clive knew her name, knew where she worked, probably knew where they lived. These were not amateurs running a small-time scam. This was organized, methodical, and clearly not the first time they had done this. She had seen the items on that table, dozens of stolen goods ready for distribution, and she had seen the look in those men's eyes when the blonde woman tried to refuse. Going to the police would mean giving statements, testifying, putting their names in official records that could be accessed by people with connections. She was convinced that cooperation with law enforcement would get them both killed. My grandfather argued with her for hours, but in the end, her fear won out. They went home that night and started packing. Within 2 weeks, they had sold everything they could not fit in their car and driven to Tucson, where my grandfather had a cousin willing to let them stay until they found their footing. They told everyone they were leaving for personal reasons, family obligations, a sick relative who needed care. They canceled recording sessions, broke contracts, burned bridges with producers and labels who had invested time and money in their careers. My grandmother said the hardest part was not the financial loss or the professional destruction, but the silence that followed. For years, she waited for a knock on the door, a threatening phone call, some sign that Clive and his people had tracked them down. It never came. She does not know what happened to the blonde woman or to Francine. She never saw any news reports about a burglary ring being dismantled, never heard the name Clive Ashford mentioned in connection with any criminal investigation. It was as if that afternoon in Van Nuys had been erased from history, existing only in her memory, a wound that never fully healed. She and my grandfather rebuilt their lives in Tucson, found regular jobs, raised my mother in quiet anonymity. They never spoke about what happened, not to each other, not to anyone. My grandfather took the secret to his dementia, and my grandmother carried it alone for 50 years, until that afternoon in her kitchen, when she finally decided I was old enough and successful enough in the same industry that had nearly destroyed her to know the truth. I drove back to Los Angeles the next day with my head spinning. I spent weeks searching for any trace of Clive Ashford, combing through old newspaper archives, industry records, public databases. I found nothing definitive, just a few mentions of a talent manager by that name who had operated in the early 70s and then seemingly vanished around 1975. No criminal charges, no obituary, no forwarding address. I thought about hiring a private investigator, about digging deeper, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the look on my grandmother's face when she finished her story, the relief mixed with residual terror that had lived in her for half a century. Maybe it was the realization that some answers are not worth finding. My grandparents sacrificed everything to disappear, to protect themselves and their future family from people who operated in shadows. Reopening that door felt like a betrayal of everything they had endured. So I let it go. I visit them more often now, and sometimes when I sit with my grandmother while my grandfather sleeps, she will mention small details she forgot to include, fragments of that day that surface unexpectedly. She told me recently that she still remembers the song playing in the lounge when she arrived. A Carpenter's track, something soft and hopeful that she can never listen to again without feeling sick. She told me she sometimes dreams about Francine, wonders if she went through with the job, wonders if she is still alive somewhere living with her own version of this secret. I do not have answers for her. All I can do is listen and make sure she knows that her story, their story, will not die when she does. Some truths deserve to be remembered, even the ones that never made it into any official record. Late summer in 2024 found me staying at my grandmother Edith's house for a few nights, trying to help my mom manage things from a distance. Life had slowed down for me then. Freelance work, no strict schedule, and a lot of quiet hours that made the request feel manageable. Edith lived alone in a modest suburban home, the kind with narrow hallways and doors that never quite lined up right. Her dementia had been getting worse, especially after sunset, but during the day she could still hold a conversation and joke about old TV shows. I told myself this was just family duty, nothing dramatic. The first evening passed with mild confusion, repeated questions and a nervous habit of checking windows. Still, she recognized me, called me by name, and insisted on making tea she forgot to drink. I slept in the guest room, shoes by the bed, just in case she wandered. At that point, fear wasn't part of the equation yet. As daylight faded the next evening, her behavior shifted in a way I hadn't seen before. Edith stopped pacing and instead sat very still at the kitchen table, eyes sharp, listening to every sound in the house. Her voice dropped when she spoke, accusing me of touching her things, moving papers, opening drawers. She asked why I kept checking my phone and who I was reporting to. When I laughed it off, she slammed her hand on the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. The warmth she carried earlier vanished, replaced by something guarded and confrontational. She followed me from room to room, keeping a careful distance, watching my hands. Every light switch I touched earned a comment. By the time I retreated to the bedroom, my chest felt tight with unease I couldn't explain. That night unfolded slowly, stretched thin by the silence of the house. The door to the guest room closed with a soft click that didn't sound like it came from my side. A moment later, metal scraped against metal, deliberate and controlled. Edith's voice came through the door, calm and steady, explaining that she needed to lock it from the outside. She said she couldn't risk letting it move freely once the house settled. I asked what she meant, keeping my voice low so I wouldn't escalate things. She told me I knew exactly what she meant and accused me of pretending. Her footsteps moved away, followed by the sound of another lock turning somewhere down the hall. Sleep never came. I sat on the bed, listening to the house breathe, counting every creak. Morning light spilled into the room through the blinds, ordinary and cruel in how normal it felt. The door opened easily when I tried it, though the frame was gouged with fresh scratches around the lock plate. The metal looked bent, stressed, as if someone had fought it from the outside. Edith stood in the kitchen humming, cheerful, asking why I looked so tired. She remembered nothing about the night, nothing about the locks, nothing about it. When I showed her the damage, she frowned like she'd never seen that door before. The house felt empty in a way I can't fully explain, like something had left quietly before dawn. I packed my bag before lunch, promising to come back soon, knowing I wouldn't sleep another night under that roof. Driving away didn't bring the relief I expected. The image of those scratches stayed vivid, looping in my head every time traffic slowed. By the afternoon, guilt crept in, heavy and persistent, so I returned the same day with groceries and a resolve to stay one more night. Edith greeted me warmly, apologetic for being difficult lately, though she couldn't explain what that meant. I inspected the doors again while she wasn't looking. The damaged locks were still there, deeper than I remembered, like grooves pressed with intent. I told myself stress had sharpened my imagination. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the hallway and she stopped smiling mid-sentence, eyes narrowing as if she'd heard a voice I couldn't. Dinner went untouched. She asked me to sit where she could see me. Once darkness settled, Edith's alertness returned sharper than before. She whispered instead of speaking, warning me not to move too fast, not to test her patience. Every few minutes she checked the hallway, pressing her ear to the wall, nodding as if listening to instructions. When I suggested calling my mom, her face hardened and she accused me of signaling. She blocked the kitchen doorway with a chair, explaining that pathways mattered at night. The house felt smaller with every adjustment she made, furniture dragged into odd positions, lamps unplugged. When I finally excused myself to the bedroom, she followed, standing just far enough away that I couldn't read her expression clearly. The door closed between us, and I waited for the sound I dreaded. This time, the locks came quickly, firm clicks followed by the unmistakable scrape of force. Edith spoke through the door again, steady and patient, saying tonight was worse, that it was learning. She said she could hear it breathing near the vents, and that it copied footsteps when it moved. I asked her to unlock the door, trying to reason, but she only replied that love sometimes meant restraint. Something brushed the other side of the door, slow and deliberate, not heavy, but intentional enough to make my pulse race. The ceiling vent rattled once, then fell silent. I sat on the floor until my legs went numb, listening to her whisper instructions to someone who wasn't there. Morning arrived, muted and gray. Edith slept in her chair, hands folded, peaceful. She laughed when I asked about the night, insisting she'd gone to bed early. The scratches on the lock were worse, curling outward like metal peeled back with fingernails. I took photos, called my mom, and arranged for in-home care that same day. When the caregiver arrived, Edith stood close to me, gripping my sleeve, quietly asking if I'd told them about it. I didn't answer. Leaving that house felt final this time, not rushed, just necessary. Whatever she believed she was protecting us from, I couldn't stay long enough to find out. I didn't go back after that day, but the house didn't leave my thoughts. Over the next week, the caregiver called twice to ask questions that made my chest tighten. She mentioned Edith insisting certain doors stay sealed after sunset, and refusing to sleep unless chairs were wedged under handles. One evening, the caregiver found Edith standing in the hallway, pressing her palm flat against a bedroom door, listening. When asked what she was doing, Edith said she was checking whether it had learned patience yet. The caregiver laughed it off at first, assuming it was part of the illness. Then she noticed the vents had been covered with towels, tightly packed, as if to block airflow. No one could explain how Edith had the strength to do that alone. A week later, a locksmith was brought in to replace the damaged hardware. He called me directly, sounding unsettled, asking what kind of force could cause that kind of wear from the outside. He said the grooves weren't consistent with tools, more like repeated pressure from something uneven. While he worked, Edith sat at the kitchen table, calm and polite, offering him candy she kept in her pocket. She told him not to worry, that it wouldn't try anything during the day. When he asked what she meant, she just smiled and said daylight made rules simpler. He finished faster than planned and refused to stay past dusk. That was the first time someone else reacted the way I had. The final incident happened less than a month later. The caregiver arrived one morning to find Edith locked inside her bedroom, door sealed from the outside, furniture dragged into place. Edith answered through the door, annoyed at being disturbed, explaining she'd done it herself to keep things contained. She was unharmed, lucid once the door was opened, and confused by everyone's concern. Adult services stepped in after that, and she was moved to a facility where nights were supervised and doors couldn't be locked manually. The house was sold not long after, emptied quickly, no questions asked. I never asked the new owners how the nights felt there. Some things don't need confirmation. I still think about the way she spoke, how calm she was when she said she couldn't let it roam. Dementia explains a lot, but it doesn't explain the damage or the way multiple people felt watched after dark in that house. Maybe she believed she was protecting us from something imaginary, or maybe fear gave her strength and purpose when her mind was failing. What I know is this: after she moved out, no more locks were scratched, no doors sealed themselves, and no one reported sounds in the vents. Whatever she thought she was keeping in check, it stopped the moment she left. And that's the part I don't try to rationalize anymore. People in this community usually understand why someone waits years before putting a story into words, and that's the case here too. I'm writing about something that happened during the last stretch of my childhood, in a quiet town where routines mattered more than questions. At the time, my days were split between school, a part-time job at a hardware store, and wandering the neighborhood with friends until the streetlights buzzed on. Life felt narrow but stable, the kind of rhythm you don't think will ever break. One person who fit into that rhythm was a girl named Kara, someone I'd known since elementary school. We lived 3 blocks apart, shared the same bus stop, and had the kind of friendship that didn't need constant talking. Her house always smelled faintly of boiled vegetables and old paper, a detail that stuck with me even then. None of us imagined how abruptly that familiar presence could vanish. Kara lived with her grandmother, a woman everyone called Mrs. Wilkes, who seemed ancient even back then. She moved slowly, spoke carefully, and kept her curtains drawn tight no matter the time of day. Over one summer, her behavior shifted in a way that adults whispered about but never explained to us. She began repeating herself mid-sentence, snapping over tiny things like shoes left by the door, or insisting the windows stay sealed even in the heat. Kara stopped staying out late and started leaving our hangouts early, always citing rules she couldn't bend. When I visited, I noticed notes taped to the fridge listing exact meal times and portions, written in shaky ink. The house felt tense, like it was holding its breath. Still, nobody called it dangerous, just sad or confusing. As months passed, Kara changed too, in subtler ways that were easy to miss if you weren't close. She started flinching when strangers walked past us on the sidewalk, tugging her sleeves down over her hands. She talked about food as if it were risky, refusing anything that hadn't been prepared a certain way. Sometimes she'd pause mid-conversation, listening for sounds no one else reacted to. When I asked what she heard, she'd shrug and change the subject. Her grandmother stopped answering the door altogether, and the mailbox filled until the metal door barely closed. Neighbors said they saw grocery deliveries left on the porch overnight. The house became a place people glanced at but avoided. Then, without warning or explanation, Kara disappeared. One day her bus seat was empty, and the next week the school office said she'd been withdrawn. Mrs. Wilkes' house went dark. The notes vanished from the windows, and a lock appeared on the outside of the gate. Adults gave rehearsed answers about family matters and told us to stop speculating. Years later, after I'd left town and built a life elsewhere, curiosity pulled me back into the story. Public records showed both Kara and her grandmother had been living in near isolation for a long time, following rigid schedules and strict rules driven by fear. Doctors later suggested untreated psychological illness, especially in the grandmother. What still unsettles me is how closely Kara's breakdown mirrored the routines she was taught, and how little anyone intervened before it was too late. After that brief look into the records, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been quietly buried. I started reaching out to people who'd known the family back then, framing it as nostalgia rather than concern. One former neighbor remembered the exact day things finally collapsed, describing it as unusually quiet, even for that street. According to her, Mrs. Wilkes had stopped allowing any noise in the house, including the radio or television. Kara had been pulled out of school weeks earlier and was rarely seen outside. That day, a delivery driver reportedly waited on the porch for nearly an hour, knocking softly, then louder, before leaving the bags untouched. No one saw movement behind the curtains. The silence bothered people more than shouting ever would have. I tracked down a retired social worker who had briefly reviewed the case years after the disappearance. She spoke carefully, choosing words like she was still being recorded. She explained that the grandmother had developed severe paranoia, centered around contamination and outside influence. Her routines weren't just habits but protective rituals, enforced with absolute authority. Kara's role shifted from child to participant, then to enforcer, mirroring behaviors that kept them safe. The records noted that Kara resisted at first, sneaking food or lingering at windows. Over time, those acts stopped. The social worker said this kind of psychological entanglement was rare but devastating, especially without intervention. What disturbed me most was learning how that final day unfolded. Emergency services were called by a neighbor after a smell-raised concern, something sour and unmistakably wrong. Inside, they found Mrs. Wilkes unresponsive, her body already cold. Kara was still alive, sitting at the kitchen table, following the schedule taped to the wall. She hadn't eaten since the previous evening because the next mealtime hadn't arrived yet. She didn't cry or speak when help arrived, only asked whether the house would be sealed again afterward. The responders noted her calm as unsettling, like someone waiting for permission to exist. Kara was taken away that day and placed into long-term care, though details about where she went were limited. Her grandmother's death was ruled natural, but the circumstances raised concerns that never led to charges. The house was sold, cleaned, and repainted, erasing visible traces of what happened inside. Still, whenever I think back to that single day, it feels like a quiet ending to a long, invisible disaster. A child learned fear as routine, obedience as safety, and isolation as love. Even now, I wonder how different things might have been if someone had knocked harder, asked more questions, or refused to look away. What followed was a kind of quiet aftermath that didn't make headlines or inspire town meetings. Kara became a topic people referenced vaguely, as if details might summon something unpleasant back into the room. I learned she was evaluated extensively and diagnosed with severe anxiety shaped by prolonged psychological control. Professionals believed she could improve, but only with long-term care and strict boundaries separating her from the patterns she'd learned. The grandmother's influence was described as pervasive, not malicious in a simple sense, but consuming. Fear had structured every hour of that house. When authorities removed Kara, they also removed the framework she understood as survival. Recovery, I was told, meant rebuilding her sense of time, choice, and trust from the ground up. I drove past the old house once after learning all this, mostly out of a need to see it with my own eyes. The curtains were open now, and someone had planted flowers along the fence line. From the outside, it looked ordinary, almost inviting. Standing there, I tried to reconcile that image with the lists on the fridge, the locked gate, the silence stretching day after day. It struck me how easily suffering can blend into a neighborhood without triggering alarms. Nobody thought to question the rules inside that home, because they were labeled as personal, private, and therefore untouchable. That realization stayed with me longer than the story itself. I sometimes think about Kara sitting at that kitchen table, following instructions that no longer protected anyone. The image isn't dramatic. just deeply sad. A child trained to obey fear until it replaced instinct. Medical explanations help, but they don't erase the feeling that something human failed long before professionals were called. The systems designed to notice patterns didn't notice hers. Friends like me didn't recognize the warning signs for what they were. We accepted oddness as character, control as care, and silence as normal. Those small allowances accumulated into years of isolation. Sharing this now isn't about reopening wounds or assigning blame. It's about acknowledging how quietly damage can spread when routines harden into law and love becomes conditional. Kara survived, and that matters, even if her life took a path none of us imagined. The house moved on, the town moved on, and most people forgot. I didn't, and I probably never will. Some stories don't end with answers, only with the knowledge that attention, when delayed, can change everything. That's the part I carry with me, and the reason I finally wrote this down. Visiting my grandparents had always meant quiet afternoons and predictable routines, but this trip felt different from the moment I passed through the stone gates of their retirement community. They had moved there less than a year earlier, drawn by glossy brochures promising longevity, comfort, and next-level wellness. The place looked more like a luxury resort than a senior complex. All glass facades, manicured hedges, and staff dressed in spotless white uniforms. Everyone I saw walking the paths looked unsettlingly healthy, with straight posture, bright eyes, and skin that didn't match their age. It was impressive at first, almost comforting, like proof that my grandparents were in good hands. Still, something about the silence bothered me, the way conversations stopped when staff passed by. My grandfather, Harold, hugged me tightly but didn't linger, glancing toward the main building as if he were being timed. My grandmother, June, smiled a lot, but it felt rehearsed, like a habit she couldn't turn off. That first evening, I chalked it up to adjusting to a new environment and told myself I was overthinking things. Staying in their guest suite came with a stack of printed rules left neatly on the table, heavier than what you'd expect for a simple visit. Visiting hours were strict, meals were mandatory at assigned times, and certain hallways were clearly marked as off-limits. One rule stood out more than the rest, stating that guests were not permitted to interfere with any medical or wellness-related activities. I asked June about it casually, trying to sound curious instead of concerned. She deflected immediately, talking instead about how good the food was and how much better she slept now. Harold barely spoke, nodding along but keeping his eyes fixed on his plate. Later that night, I noticed security cameras in the hallways, far more than seemed reasonable for a place like this. Even the elevators required keycards, and residents were escorted during certain hours. It didn't feel like protection, it felt like supervision. The next morning, I followed my grandparents to what they called a wellness session, expecting something like physical therapy or yoga. Instead, they were separated at a set of double doors labeled with a clinical code instead of a name. Guests weren't allowed inside, so I waited nearby, pretending to scroll on my phone while listening. From behind the doors came low humming sounds, mechanical and steady, mixed with voices giving calm instructions. Residents went in relaxed and talkative, but when they came back out, their expressions were blank, their movements precise, almost synchronized. One woman passed me, her pupils oddly dilated, her smile fixed as if she'd forgotten why she was smiling. A staff member noticed me watching and gently repositioned himself between me and the doorway without saying a word. The message was clear enough without language. When my grandparents returned, they claimed everything was fine, but neither could explain what the procedure actually involved. As the day went on, small details started piling up in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. I overheard two residents whispering near the garden, one asking the other how many cycles they had left. In the common lounge, a television looped promotional videos about vitality and extended lifespan, always cutting away before explaining how it was achieved. I noticed locked doors marked as medical storage, each with biometric scanners instead of simple locks. During lunch, June repeated the same story twice, word for word, unaware she'd already told it. Harold's hands rested perfectly still on the table, not even trembling when he lifted his glass. When I asked about friends they'd made there, they struggled to name anyone who had moved out or passed away. That was when it hit me that no one ever seemed to leave this place. Not really. That afternoon, curiosity pushed past politeness, and I took a longer walk alone through the community while my grandparents rested. Behind the main recreational wing, a service corridor branched off toward a low building with frosted windows and no signage. A faint antiseptic smell hung in the air, sharp enough to sting the nose. Two residents in identical robes waited on a bench nearby, wrists marked with thin, red impressions like tight bands had been removed recently. One of them noticed me looking and quietly warned me not to ask questions if I planned on enjoying my stay. Before I could respond, a staff member appeared and guided them inside, locking the door behind them with a keypad. The hallway lights dimmed slightly after they entered, as if conserving energy or hiding activity. Standing there alone, the place no longer felt luxurious, just controlled and carefully sealed. Dinner that evening was quieter than the night before, and the dining hall buzzed with an artificial cheer that felt forced. Conversations revolved around improvements, clearer thinking, stronger joints, better memory, all spoken in the same calm cadence. Harold mentioned a new treatment he'd been approved for, something that required a small contribution, though he couldn't explain what that meant. June squeezed his arm gently when he spoke, her eyes darting toward a nearby staff member before returning to her plate. Later, back in the suite, I pressed them harder than I had before, asking what they'd signed when they moved in. They admitted there were contracts, dense ones, outlining long-term care agreements and consent for experimental wellness programs. The word experimental sat between us, heavy and unresolved. Neither of them could say exactly what they'd agreed to in exchange for staying there. Night settled in, and sleep didn't come easily, so I listened to the building around me. Somewhere below, machinery ran in steady intervals, not loud enough to identify but persistent enough to notice. Footsteps echoed in the corridor at regular times, followed by soft knocks and doors opening without conversation. From my window, I could see a small group of residents being escorted across the courtyard, robes pulled tight, faces expressionless under the dim lights. No one resisted, no one questioned where they were going. A realization started forming, uncomfortable and slow, that this place thrived on compliance more than care. Longevity wasn't being offered freely. It was being traded for something unspoken. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, the idea that my grandparents were part of a system feeding on fear of aging refused to leave my mind. By morning, resolve replaced hesitation, and I confronted a staff supervisor in the lobby, asking directly what these procedures involved. The response was smooth and rehearsed, full of vague language about regenerative therapies and cognitive preservation. When I mentioned residents not remembering basic details or repeating themselves, her tone shifted just slightly, enough to notice. She reminded me that participation was voluntary and that extended life required commitment and sacrifice. That word again, sacrifice, echoed louder than anything else she said. When I returned to the suite, Harold and June were already dressed, ready for another session they hadn't told me about. They insisted I should enjoy the amenities while I could, speaking as if time there was limited for visitors like me. Watching them walk away with their assigned escort, the distance between suspicion and certainty finally closed. I couldn't let it end there, so I made one last attempt to reach them before leaving, catching Harold alone near the garden just before lunch. Up close, the changes were impossible to ignore, not dramatic but deeply wrong in subtle ways. His gaze lingered a second too long before recognizing me, and his voice carried a flat steadiness that didn't belong to him. He talked about how aging was a choice people made when they stopped investing in themselves, repeating phrases I'd heard in the promotional videos. When I asked if he was happy, he paused, searching for the word like it had slipped out of reach. June appeared beside him, guiding him away gently, thanking me for visiting with a politeness that felt practiced. Watching them walk off together, I understood they weren't just residents anymore. They were assets in a system built to harvest hope and obedience. Before leaving, I stopped by the front desk to formally check out, hoping someone might slip and say something real. Instead, I was handed a pamphlet about future enrollment opportunities and told visitors often reconsider once they see the benefits firsthand. The implication wasn't subtle, and it left a sour weight in my chest. As I waited for my ride beyond the gates, another group of new arrivals rolled in, laughing, impressed, carrying suitcases full of trust. The staff welcomed them warmly, already easing them into the rhythm of rules and reassurances. I wanted to warn them, to say something, anything, but every part of the place seemed designed to smother doubt before it could take root. Leaving felt less like a goodbye and more like an escape. Once home, I tried to convince myself that reporting the place would change something, but every attempt hit a wall of legality and consent forms. Everything had been signed, approved, sanitized by language that hid consequences behind promises. My grandparents stopped answering calls after a while, and when they did respond, their messages were short and oddly formal. They spoke about progress, clarity, commitment, words that sounded less like them each time. Months later, I received a letter informing me that visits were no longer recommended for the sake of their continued wellness. No explanation, just a polite closing statement and a signature from someone I'd never met. It felt like being quietly written out of their lives. What stays with me now isn't just fear, but the understanding of how easily people can be guided when the alternative is decline and loss. That community never needed chains or threats, only the promise of more time and the subtle erosion of choice. I still think about Harold's pause when I asked if he was happy, that brief gap where the truth almost surfaced. Whatever they're doing there works, at least on the surface, and that's the most disturbing part. The residents look alive, vibrant even, but something essential has been traded away. I don't know if my grandparents are still themselves anymore, only that they chose to stay, and the system made sure that choice became permanent.